Hey guys, tonight we are going to delve into a corner of history so strange, so delightfully unexpected, that honestly you might find your sleepy brains trying to reject it entirely. Imagine for a moment the musty scent of aged parchment, the weight of heavy leather bindings, the quiet contemplation in a dimly lit room, a medieval prayer book. Seems simple, right? A devout object for a devout age. But what if, tucked away inside, hidden within a painstakingly carved out cavity, was something else entirely? Something decidedly less pious, shall we say? You're venturing into the world of hollowed out history, folks, where even the most sacred objects could hold the most profane secrets. This is the kind of histories that whispers from the shadows, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about those dark ages. And frankly, keeping your eyes open for the next 1,000 words might be the biggest challenge of your night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. All right, settle in. You're transported back, not to the gleaming castles or the epic battles of your history textbooks. Oh no, you're somewhere quieter, darker, maybe a little bit damp. You're in a modest dwelling in, say, 14th century England. The air smells of wood smoke, damp earth, maybe a touch of the livestock outside. The light comes from a sputtering candle or perhaps the dying embers of the hearth. You're a woman living a life governed by the seasons, the demands of the farm or household, and most significantly, the omnipresent rhythm of the church. Your days are punctuated by prayer, your actions guided by religious doctrine, your every sin potentially noted down for eternal judgment. Life is hard, often brutal, and utterly public. Privacy? What's that? You live cheek by jowl with your family, often in a single room. Secrets are hard to keep, possessions are few and practical. A wooden chest might hold your spare linen or tools, but nothing is truly secure. Nothing truly yours alone in the way we understand it today. Now, in this world, your prayer book, if you are fortunate enough to own one, and that's a big if for most people, is a treasured object. It's not just paper and ink. It's a lifeline to the divine, a manual for salvation, a status symbol perhaps, but primarily a tool for engaging with your faith. It contains psalms, prayers, maybe a calendar noting feast days. You handle it with reverence. You use it daily. It is in every sense a holy object. It represents piety, devotion, adherence to the strict moral code laid down by the church. And the church, let me tell you, had a lot to say about morality, particularly your morality. They were like the original neighborhood watch, but with eternal consequences. So picture this. You're a woman in this world. Your life is constrained. Your body, your desires, even your thoughts are supposed to conform to a rigid framework defined by men, filtered through religious texts interpreted by more men. Maybe you're married, maybe not, but regardless, your personal autonomy, especially concerning your sexuality, is, well, let's just say it's not exactly a modern feminist paradise out there. Everything from your clothing to your conversation is under scrutiny. And yet, you possess internal feelings, desires, a need for some kind of private solace, perhaps physical or emotional. How do you reconcile the outward performance of piety with the inner landscape of being human? Where do you put anything that doesn't fit the approved narrative of your life? Especially something deeply personal, perhaps even forbidden. This is where the bizarre, intriguing, and slightly scandalous idea we're exploring tonight comes in. The notion that in this world of limited space, limited privacy, and intense religious oversight, someone might look at their most sacred possession, their prayer book, and see not just a path to heaven, but a potential hiding place. A place so utterly unlikely to conceal anything illicit that it becomes, paradoxically, the perfect spot. Think about it. Who would suspect a prayer book? It's handled openly, perhaps even displayed. It's the last place you'd expect to find, well, anything remotely racy. It's the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, or perhaps more accurately, a personal pleasure dice in a devotional text. See, we're getting a little cheeky already. Told you this wasn't going to be too boring. This concept isn't just plucked from thin air, although piecing together the reality behind it is tricky. Historians still argue whether the items found were always what modern eyes interpret them to be, or how widespread this practice actually was. But the mere possibility of it shatters that often held simplistic image of the Middle Ages as purely dark, purely devout, purely, well, medieval in the cartoonish sense. It suggests a hidden life, a layer of private resistance or self-soothing occurring right under the nose of the oppressive moral structure of the time. It's like finding a secret Spotify playlist of questionable tunes hidden inside your grandparents' Bible app. Utterly unexpected, slightly jarring, and deeply human. You see the weight of the book in your hands, the thick, hand-stitched binding, perhaps worn smooth from countless hours of prayer. You feel the texture of the vellum pages, maybe notice the faint, lingering smell of old paper, and whatever environmental scents have clung to it over the centuries. It feels solid, virtuous, entirely proper. And the idea that someone, perhaps a woman like you, driven by circumstances or desire, might have taken this object of piety and painstakingly carved out a space within its pages, creating a secret compartment, fills you with a strange mix of understanding and disbelief. Why go to all that trouble? Why deface, in a way, something so sacred? And what would be valuable enough or forbidden enough to warrant such an audacious hiding spot? Was it money, a forbidden letter, or something much, much more personal? The contrast between the container and the potential contents is what makes this story so compelling, and perhaps just intriguing enough to keep those eyelids from fully closing. For now, you're still holding that imagined book, feeling its weight, its history, and you're likely wondering, okay, so people hid things, but why books? And why a prayer book? Well, let's rewind slightly, because the idea of using books for secret storage isn't entirely unique to medieval prayer books, or shall we say, their most titillating contents. People have been getting creative with hiding spots for as long as they have had things they didn't want others to find. Think secret compartments in furniture, false bottoms in trunks, even that classic spy trope of the microfilm hidden inside a hollowed-out coin. Necessity, or maybe just a touch of paranoia, is the mother of invention when it comes to stashing your valuables or your secrets. And books, it turns out, offer a rather ingenious solution. They're common objects, especially in certain circles. They have volume, and they're often left lying around in plain sight without arousing suspicion. People pick them up, look at them, maybe even read them. It's the ultimate camouflage. A casual glance, a flick through the pages, and everything seems perfectly normal. Who would think to check for a cavity carved deep within the text block? It's like hiding your diary inside a geometry textbook, brilliant in its sheer unlikeliness. Okay, maybe less relevant in the age of cloud storage, but you get the idea. So, before we get to the more scandalous findings, let's talk about the broader historical use of hollowed-out books for concealment. This practice has popped up various times and places, often driven by political upheaval, censorship, or simply the need to safeguard something precious. During periods of intense political repression or religious persecution, books themselves could be dangerous objects. Possessing the wrong text could land you in serious trouble, but ironically, a book could also be the perfect place to hide something else that was dangerous or illicit. Imagine, for instance, the Reformation era. Religious texts were being translated, printed, and smuggled across borders, challenging the established order. Carrying a banned pamphlet could be risky, but tucking it into a hollowed-out legal treatise or even a seemingly harmless volume of classical poetry? Much harder to detect. Or think about periods of war when people needed to hide jewels, money, or important documents quickly. A sturdy book, often one of the few substantial objects owned by a household, could be pressed into service. You slice out a careful rectangle from the center of the pages, creating a neat little box, glue the outer edges to make it look solid, and voila, instant safe. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates this sort of thing is the use of hollowed-out books for smuggling and espionage, particularly in more modern periods. But the principle is the same. Spies in the 20th century were known to use hollowed books to carry secret documents or small items across borders. It's a classic spycraft technique, but the roots of this ingenuity go back further. Think of the simple need to hide something valuable from thieves or from prying eyes within your own household. A hollowed book provided a discreet, accessible yet hidden spot. You can almost feel the care, the tedious process involved in creating such a hiding place. It's not something you do in 5 minutes. You'd need a sharp knife, a steady hand, and a willingness to sacrifice a perfectly good book, or at least its usability for reading cover to cover. You'd select a thick volume, maybe one you didn't intend to read anytime soon, or perhaps one you could easily replace if the operation went wrong. You'd open it part way, draw a rectangle on the first page you intend to cut, and then page by page, you'd slice, slice, slice. The paper dust would accumulate, the smell of old paper would fill the air, and you'd have to be careful not to cut too deep or too shallow, not to slice through the cover or the spine. It requires patience, precision, and a clear purpose. It wasn't just a quick hack, it was a deliberate act of transformation. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of this practice was genuinely widespread or limited to specific circumstances and social strata. Was it something only the wealthy or those in positions of power could do because they owned books in the first place? Or was it a trick known and used by people lower down the social ladder when the need arose and they could get their hands on a suitable volume? It's hard to say definitively without more physical evidence or written accounts explicitly detailing the practice. Most discoveries are chance finds by librarians, collectors, or researchers examining old books for other reasons. You don't exactly find medieval instruction manuals titled How to Make a Secret Book Safe, a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this, while many hollowed books simply had a rough cavity carved out. Some examples found from various periods show remarkable craftsmanship. We're talking lined compartments, hinged covers made from the original book cover, or even multiple hidden layers within the same book. It suggests that for some, this wasn't just a quick fix, but a significant project, perhaps even a display of skill or a commitment to long-term secrecy. Imagine the satisfaction of revealing a perfectly crafted, hidden space within an unassuming object. It's like finding a secret level in a video game you thought you'd completed. So you see, the concept of a hollowed-out book as a hiding place has historical precedent. It's a testament to human ingenuity and the persistent need for secrecy. People hid letters, coins, small weapons, forbidden documents, anything they needed to keep out of sight. The book, in its guise as a harmless object of learning or devotion, provided the perfect cover. Now bring your focus back to the medieval period we're exploring tonight, and specifically back to the prayer book. In a society where books were rare and precious, owning a prayer book was a significant thing. It wasn't just a book, it was the book for many people, their most important textual possession, if they had one at all. This scarcity and significance made it an even more potent hiding spot. Who would damage or desecrate such an object? Who would think to look inside its pages for something other than prayers? It elevated the principle of hiding in plain sight to a new level, especially considering the intense religious scrutiny of the time. The very sacredness of the object provided the ultimate camouflage. It wasn't just any old book. It was a conduit to the divine, a symbol of piety. To tamper with it, to turn it into a mundane or worse, an illicit storage unit, seems almost unthinkable. And yet the discoveries suggest that for some, the need for a secure, private hiding spot, even within the most public and sacred aspect of their lives, outweighed the reverence for the object itself. Or perhaps the act of hollowing the book became part of the secrecy, a private defiance hidden behind a public display of devotion. This historical context of book hollowing for various purposes, from smuggling documents to hiding valuables, is crucial because it shows the method wasn't entirely new. The application of that method to a medieval prayer book for potentially sensitive items, however, adds layers of cultural, social, and religious complexity. It takes the general idea of a book safe and makes it deeply personal. And given the specific items later associated with these medieval prayer books, incredibly revealing about the private lives of people we often imagine as purely pious and repressed. The stage is set. The possibility of a hidden compartment within a book is established. Now, what exactly went into those hidden spaces in medieval prayer books? That's where things get particularly interesting. You're still fixated on that prayer book, that hollowed out space. Because let's be honest, the method of hollowing books is neat, a fun historical detail, but it's the contents that really snag your attention, isn't it? The idea that someone, hundreds of years ago, painstakingly carved a secret cavity into their most sacred possession, and then put something inside, the mystery begs to be unraveled. What would you hide in such a personal, religiously charged object? You might expect to find things you wouldn't want others to see, but that still fit the general solemnity of a prayer book. Maybe a lock of a loved one's hair, tucked away as a memento. Perhaps a small personal charm or relic, something devotional but not intended for public display. You could imagine a hidden message, a letter passed illicitly between secret lovers or political conspirators, though the latter feels less likely in a prayer book specifically. But hey, people are surprising. Maybe even a few coins, a small stash of emergency cash, hidden away from prying eyes, be they thieves or disapproving spouses. These kinds of finds, while historically interesting, wouldn't necessarily shatter your perception of medieval life. They feel plausible, predictable even. But then sometimes you find something that makes you do a double take. Something that yanks you out of the hushed reverence of the medieval scriptorium and drops you, rather abruptly, into the messy, often surprising reality of human desires and needs. And that, my friends, is where the dildos come in. Yes, you heard that right. Among the historical discoveries of items hidden in various places, including hollowed-out books, are objects that are unmistakably sex toys, specifically phallic objects designed for sexual pleasure. Now, before you clutch your pearls, or perhaps reach for them depending on your inclination, remember we're talking about medieval women in a society we often picture as rigidly religious and sexually repressed. The contrast is stark, which is precisely why these findings are so fascinating and, frankly, a little bit hilarious in their subversion of expectation. Imagine the face of the first librarian who found one of those tucked inside a book of hours. These aren't always easy to date precisely, and the evidence isn't abundant, but there are archaeological finds from medieval contexts that have been identified as dildos. And some of the suggestions and theories about the contents of hollowed-out prayer books specifically point to these kinds of items being among the things medieval women might have wanted to hide. The logic, or perhaps the dark humor, is undeniable. Hide your forbidden pleasure object inside the symbol of your public piety. It's the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing scenario, but for, self-gratification. What did these medieval dildos look like? Well, archaeological finds suggest they came in various materials and forms. Some were carved from wood, others from bone or even hardened leather. They range in size and shape, some relatively simple, others more elaborate, perhaps hinting at craftsmanship or personal preference. They might not look exactly like the silicone wonders you see in modern shops, but their purpose is, let's say, historically consistent. Finding one of these adds a layer of unexpected complexity to our understanding of medieval life. It reminds you that medieval people, despite the vast cultural differences, shared some fundamental human needs and desires. They weren't just automatons praying in drafty churches. They had private lives, bodies, and perhaps a need for some discreet fun. A mainstream historical fact here is that medieval society, while influenced heavily by Christian doctrine, which often viewed non-procreative sex negatively, was also a place where people navigated complex personal lives. Marriage was a social and economic necessity, but it didn't always fulfill individual emotional or physical needs. And for women, particularly those in religious orders or unmarried individuals, options for sanctioned sexual expression were limited. Personal hygiene and health were also concerns, and historical texts, though often prescriptive or moralizing, do touch upon women's bodies and their needs, albeit usually in a medical or reproductive context. But the existence of personal items related to bodily needs and desires hidden away speaks volumes about the realities beneath the surface. Historians still argue whether these findings represent a common practice among medieval women or are isolated instances reflecting specific individual circumstances. Were dildos widespread and discreetly used, or were they rare objects, perhaps associated with specific subcultures or even practices considered deviant by the mainstream? The very act of hiding them suggests discretion was paramount, making it difficult to gauge their true prevalence. Were these specific objects always hidden in prayer books, or is the association more theoretical, based on the kinds of things people might want to conceal and the fact that prayer books were used for concealment? It's a puzzle with pieces scattered across archaeology, social history, and the tricky interpretation of silence in the historical record. A quirky or fringe tidbit to ponder. Some theories suggest these objects might have been used for medicinal or therapeutic purposes rather than purely for pleasure, citing medieval medical texts that discuss women's health in sometimes surprisingly frank terms. However, the form of some discovered objects makes a purely medical explanation feel less convincing, especially when you consider the context of hiding them. It's like finding a set of poker chips in a hollowed-out Bible and arguing they were used for counting prayers. Possible, but probably not the main reason. The more compelling and entertaining interpretation leans towards personal use, likely for pleasure, perhaps born of necessity or simply desire. So you see, the contents of these hollowed-out prayer books, or at least the suspected contents based on related archaeological finds and historical context, paint a picture far more complex than simple piety. They hint at secret lives, hidden desires, and the ingenious ways people found to carve out spaces for themselves, both physically and metaphorically, within the confines of their society. The prayer book, a symbol of spiritual devotion, becomes an unwitting accomplice in a very human story of privacy and self-discovery. It's a reminder that people, regardless of the era, were just people, trying to navigate their world with its rules, its expectations, and its sometimes unmet needs. The next section delves deeper into why a prayer book specifically was the chosen hiding spot, exploring the social and religious context that made it both a logical and a daring choice. So you're sitting there, maybe picturing this slightly scandalous discovery, this peek behind the medieval curtain, and the question naturally arises: why a prayer book? Of all the places to stash something you definitely, absolutely did not want anyone to find, why choose your most sacred, most frequently handled possession? It seems counterintuitive at first glance, almost comically risky, but as you settle deeper into the thought, maybe letting your eyelids feel a little heavy, you start to see the quiet, almost brilliant logic behind it. It's not just about physical concealment, it's about social camouflage, about hiding in plain sight within the most respected object you owned. Let's think about what a prayer book was in the medieval period. It wasn't like picking up a cheap paperback at a gas station today. Books, especially illuminated manuscripts designed for personal devotion, were incredibly valuable objects. Think of them as a combination of a luxury good, a piece of art, and a crucial tool for spiritual life. They were painstakingly created by scribes and illuminators, often on expensive vellum or parchment, prepared animal skins. Yeah, maybe don't think too hard about that part as you drift off. Binding was often sturdy, using wood boards covered in leather, sometimes adorned with metalwork, jewels, or carved ivory. These weren't flimsy things. They had heft, presence. Imagine holding one of these. It feels solid, substantial. The covers could be quite thick, perhaps half an inch or more of wood and binding materials, and the book itself contained hundreds of pages, bound tightly. This physical density and size were the first layer of defense. To hollow out a cavity large enough to hide something, say an object a few inches long, required carving into these thick covers or into the dense block of pages itself. We're not talking about just tucking something inside a loose page. This was a deliberate, laborious process. You'd need tools, patience, and a willingness to permanently alter a very expensive and significant object. This physical act of hollowing itself is fascinating. It's not a quick job. You'd have to carefully measure, perhaps use a sharp knife or chisel, scoop out material, being careful not to go too deep and pierce the other side, or damage the binding too much. The edges would need to be neat so the cover could close properly without revealing the secret. It's a craft in itself, almost a subversive form of bookmaking. Think of it like creating a secret compartment in furniture, but the furniture is also your Bible. The skill and effort involved suggests that whatever was being hidden was deemed important enough to warrant this kind of dedicated, potentially damaging work on a prized possession. Now consider the social context. Prayer books, particularly books of hours, popular personalized prayer books containing prayers for various times of the day, were ubiquitous among the literate or semi-literate upper classes and clergy. Women, especially those with means or in religious orders, often owned them. They were used daily, carried around, displayed during religious services or private devotion. A prayer book was, in many ways, an extension of the owner's identity, a public declaration of piety and literacy, which wasn't universal, making ownership even more significant. And this is where the genius of the hiding place truly lies. Because the prayer book was such a normal, expected, and respected object, it was the last thing anyone would treat with suspicion or disrespect. You wouldn't just casually pick up and leaf through someone else's prayer book without permission. It would be considered rude, intrusive, a violation of personal space and privacy. These books were handled with reverence, often kept in special covers or satchels, protected from damage. To examine one closely, to feel its weight, to check its binding for irregularities. That would be highly unusual behavior. Imagine the scene. You're visiting a friend, perhaps a noblewoman, in her chamber. Her prayer book sits on a nearby table or lectern. It's a beautiful object, maybe illuminated with gold leaf. You admire it from a distance, perhaps comment on its beauty or the skill of the scribe. But you wouldn't just grab it, flip through the pages, and start shaking it upside down to see if anything falls out. That would be unthinkable. It was considered a private, personal item tied directly to the owner's spiritual life. This social barrier was incredibly effective. The sacred nature of the object, the respect it commanded, created an invisible shield. Anyone thinking of prying would hesitate, deterred by social norms and the perceived sanctity of the book. So while the physical act of hiding involved modifying the book, the security of the hiding place came from its social and religious significance. You could keep your deepest secrets, your most private possessions, literally within reach, on your person or nearby, knowing that the object itself acted as the perfect deterrent to unwanted scrutiny. It's a beautiful dark irony, isn't it? Hiding a tool for personal pleasure within the very symbol of religious devotion and moral uprightness. It speaks volumes about the pressures of medieval society and the lengths to which people went to create private spaces for themselves, physically and emotionally. The prayer book becomes a metaphor for navigating a world with rigid rules, outwardly conforming while carving out hidden pockets for autonomy and personal needs. It's like wearing a perfectly tailored suit while keeping a secret stash of candy in a hidden pocket. A mainstream historical fact that underpins this is the immense value and status associated with books, particularly religious manuscripts, throughout the Middle Ages. Before the advent of the printing press, every book was a unique, handwritten artifact. Creating one was a lengthy, expensive process, often commissioned by wealthy individuals or institutions. Owning a personal prayer book was a clear indicator of social standing, literacy, and piety. These were heirlooms, sometimes passed down through generations. They weren't just reading material, they were capital, art, and spiritual guides, all rolled into one heavy, precious package. Their value alone discouraged casual handling by others. Historians still argue whether this practice of hollowing books for concealment was relatively common among certain groups, or if it was a rare, ingenious solution used by a few individuals desperate for privacy. Was it something whispered about among close friends, a known trick of the time, or was each instance a unique, isolated act of subversion? The lack of explicit historical text detailing this practice makes it hard to gauge its prevalence. We find the physical evidence, the hollowed books, and we theorize about their contents and purpose based on what seems plausible or has been found elsewhere. But the true scope remains elusive. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit to chew on. While we're focusing on prayer books, the practice of hiding things within books wasn't exclusive to them. Nor were books the only things modified for concealment. People hollowed out furniture, created secret compartments in walls, and even modified clothing or accessories. But the prayer book stands out because of the nature of the object being modified. It's the juxtaposition that's so striking. There are even accounts, though less substantiated and leaning towards folklore, of people hiding small weapons or poisons in books, especially during times of political intrigue, though a prayer book seems less likely for such overt purposes than, say, a legal text or a history. Still, it highlights a broader historical trend. If you had something valuable or secret, you found creative ways to keep it close and hidden, often using objects that were commonplace or commanded respect. So the prayer book wasn't just a container, it was a carefully chosen sanctuary. Its physical form allowed for modification, and its social standing provided unparalleled security. It was a daring choice, a quiet act of rebellion wrapped in piety. It tells us that medieval women, and likely others, were not passive figures strictly confined by societal expectations. They were resourceful, they had private needs and desires, and they found ways, sometimes profoundly ironic ones, to assert their autonomy and privacy in a world that offered little of either. The object itself, this heavy leather-bound testament to faith, became a silent co-conspirator in their hidden lives. It makes you look at old books with new eyes, doesn't it? You never know what secrets are truly held within their covers, beyond the words printed on the page. The next section will delve further into the lives of the women who might have engaged in this practice, trying to understand their circumstances and motivations. As you settle further into the thought, perhaps letting your breathing slow, the question naturally drifts towards the people themselves. Who were these women who felt the need to carve secrets into the very heart of their devotional lives? What were their days like, and what circumstances might have led them to seek such clandestine comfort or privacy? It pulls you into the rich, complex tapestry of medieval female existence, which was, let's be honest, a far cry from sipping lattes and scrolling through TikTok. Imagine yourself in their shoes for a moment. You're a woman in, say, the 14th or 15th century. Your life is profoundly shaped by your social class, your family, and the omnipresent authority of the church. If you're a noblewoman, you might live in a vast, cold stone castle filled with servants, family members, and visitors. Privacy, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent. You shared rooms, sometimes even beds. Your life was a public performance, constantly under scrutiny. Your marriage was likely arranged for political or economic gain, often at a very young age. Your primary duties involved managing a large household, bearing children, and surviving childbirth, which was a major undertaking, truly a roll of the dice every time, and upholding your family's honor and piety. Your days would be structured around religious observation, attending Mass, reciting prayers from your precious book, perhaps managing almsgiving or supervising estate matters if your husband was away or deceased. You'd be surrounded by people, always. Your ladies-in-waiting, servants, tutors for your children, visiting relatives. Finding a moment entirely to yourself, free from observant eyes or listening ears, would be a rare luxury. In this environment, a personal prayer book, handled during moments of quiet devotion, could genuinely be one of the few items you possess that felt truly yours and was treated with a degree of respect and non-interference. If you were a woman in a religious order, a nun in a convent, your life would be even more rigidly structured. Your days dictated by the monastic rule, devoted to prayer, work, and communal living. While convents offered a degree of intellectual and social refuge for women who didn't marry, they certainly weren't bastions of personal freedom. Privacy was minimal, communal life was the norm. Yet even within these walls, individuals had personal belongings, and the prayer book remained a central, highly personal item. The pressures might be different: spiritual struggles, internal politics, strict adherence to vows, but the need for a private space for one's thoughts, or even one's secret comforts, could still exist. Even for women in towns, perhaps from merchant families, life was less grand than nobility, but still often centered around the family business and household. While not living in castles, homes were smaller but often multi-generational and busy. The concept of a private bedroom or personal space was still not standard. Your life was intertwined with your family and community. Across all these classes, the dominant social and religious narrative placed strict controls on female behavior, especially concerning sexuality. Female desire was often viewed with suspicion, something inherently dangerous that needed to be controlled, usually by marriage and the supervision of men, fathers, husbands, brothers, priests. Expressing personal sexual needs or exploring one's own pleasure outside of the confines of procreative marriage was largely taboo, a sin in the eyes of the church. This societal pressure, this constant surveillance and suppression of female autonomy, particularly concerning their bodies and desires, provides a powerful context for why a woman might seek a secret, private means of pleasure. The dildo, if that is indeed what was being hidden, represents an assertion of control over one's own body and pleasure in a world that sought to deny it. Hiding it in a prayer book adds layers of irony and subversion, using the symbol of pious conformity to conceal an act of personal rebellion. It's like hiding your favorite junk food inside a box of kale, unexpected, slightly naughty, and probably very effective at keeping others away. Consider the simple lack of options. Medieval society offered limited avenues for female expression or escape from prescribed roles. Marriage, the convent, or a precarious existence as a single woman or widow were the main paths. Within these structures, personal freedom was curtailed. For women whose marriages were unhappy, loveless, or arranged out of duty, for those living under strict religious vows, or simply for women seeking a personal outlet free from judgment or the risks associated with illicit relationships, a private source of pleasure could be a significant comfort, a tiny pocket of self-ownership in a world where so little was truly theirs. The very act of modifying the prayer book speaks to a deep need for secrecy. It wasn't just about having the object, it was about keeping its existence hidden. This suggests the severe consequences of discovery, shame, scandal, religious condemnation, perhaps even physical punishment or forced penance. The risk was high, so the need must have been profound. Mainstream historical fact: a key aspect of medieval women's lives was their legal status, which was generally subordinate to men. Under common law and canon law, married women, femme couvert, had limited legal rights independent of their husbands. Their property often became their husband's upon marriage. Their contracts were often not legally binding without his consent, and their ability to act in the public sphere was restricted. While some women, particularly widows or spinsters, could achieve a degree of independence, the default social structure placed women under male authority. This legal and social framework meant that personal autonomy, including control over one's own body and desires, was often constrained and subject to external control. This lack of legal personhood reinforces why finding a private, secret sphere was so crucial for some. Historians still argue whether the discovery of dildos, or other items, in hollowed-out prayer books represents a widespread, albeit secret, practice among medieval women, or if these are isolated, albeit fascinating, examples of individual ingenuity and desperation. The evidence is scattered and archaeological. Explicit written accounts of women using such items for personal pleasure are, unsurprisingly, extremely rare, given the social taboos. This makes it difficult to gauge how common this was. Was it a whispered secret among friends, a practice passed discreetly between women? Or were these individual responses to personal circumstances, each woman coming up with the idea independently? The lack of a clear historical record leaves this open to significant scholarly debate and interpretation. A quirky or fringe tidbit: while we're thinking about personal items and privacy, or lack thereof, consider medieval hygiene. Bathing was less frequent than in some other periods, and personal grooming was different. Women used various cosmetics, perfumes, often strong ones to mask body odor. Think less Chanel No. 5, more ode to desperately trying to smell better than a damp dog. And herbal remedies. They wore layers of clothing, and undergarments weren't standardized or laundered with the frequency we expect today. All this creates a sensory picture very different from modern life. In a world where personal space and modern cleanliness were not the norm, possessing a clean, private object, even something mundane, could feel very personal. And keeping a secret item clean and hidden in such an environment would have presented its own unique challenges, perhaps even requiring careful wrapping or containment within the hollowed book itself. So the women who potentially used hollowed-out prayer books for concealment were likely navigating a world with immense social pressure, strict religious dogma, and little personal privacy or autonomy. Whether noble lady, cloistered nun, or merchant's wife, they face constraints that are difficult for us to fully grasp today. The act of creating a secret space within their most public and pious possession speaks volumes about their resilience, resourcefulness, and perhaps a quiet determination to claim some small part of their lives as their own, free from the watchful eyes of society, family, and the church. They weren't just passive figures in history, they were individuals with needs, desires, and the cleverness to find clandestine ways to meet them. The next section will dive deeper into the object itself, the mysterious medieval dildo, and what little we know about its form and construction during this period. So, we've peeked into the lives of the women who might have sought such a secret space, navigating a world of intense social constraints and a profound lack of privacy. Now let's turn our attention to the object itself, the mysterious dildo hidden away. What exactly are we talking about when we refer to a medieval dildo? This isn't like popping into your local adult store today, where you're faced with shelves groaning under the weight of silicone, jelly, and vibrating marvels in every conceivable shape and size. The reality of medieval sex toys, particularly those potentially used by women for private pleasure, is far more nebulous, based on scattered clues and educated guesses. Imagine the materials available at the time. We're talking pre-plastics, pre-synthetics. The world was made of wood, stone, bone, leather, cloth, and metal. If someone wanted to fashion a personal pleasure device, they had to work with what was readily at hand. This is where things get fascinatingly low-tech and highly resourceful. One primary material, perhaps the most accessible and easily shaped, would have been wood. You could carve wood into various forms. Think of a piece of wood whittled smooth, perhaps shaped roughly like a phallus, or perhaps just a comfortable rounded shape. The level of craftsmanship would vary wildly, from a simple, rough and ready piece to something potentially quite artfully smooth and polished. The challenge with wood, of course, is hygiene and porosity, which might have required some kind of covering or careful cleaning. It's not exactly the non-porous medical-grade silicone we expect today, is it? You'd probably want to avoid splinters too, not exactly conducive to a good time, so smoothing and finishing would have been key. Bone or ivory could also have been used, especially for smaller, more durable objects. These materials are hard and can be polished to a smooth surface. Think of bone needles, handles, or decorative items that have survived from the period. They demonstrate the ability to shape and polish these materials. A dildo made of bone might be quite small and discreet, easily hidden. However, bone can be brittle, and sourcing enough suitable material might have been a challenge depending on your location and access to animals, or tusks if we're talking ivory, which would likely be a luxury item. Leather is another possibility. Layered and stitched leather, possibly stuffed with something like wool or rags, could create a softer, more yielding form. This would be less rigid than wood or bone, perhaps more comfortable and easier to conceal. Leather could also potentially be molded to a specific shape. Think of medieval leather pouches, boots, or even armor components. The material was versatile and widely used. A leather dildo might be less identifiable as such at first glance, blending in with other household items or travel gear. Less likely, but not impossible, are materials like stone or metal. Stone could be shaped but would be heavy and cold. Metal like bronze or iron could be cast or forged, but again, weight and temperature would be factors, not to mention the potential cost and the level of skill required to craft something suitable. While some archaeological finds hint at metal staves or implements whose original purpose is debated, they don't scream dildo in the same way some other potential objects do. So the medieval dildo, if found, would likely have been a simple, handmade object fashioned from common materials, probably chosen for ease of shaping, relative comfort, and durability. It wouldn't have been a mass-produced item. Each one would have been unique, likely made by the woman herself, or perhaps a trusted accomplice, maybe a confidant, or even purchased discreetly from someone skilled in crafting small items. Although finding someone willing to publicly sell such a thing would have been incredibly difficult and risky. How do we know any of this? This is where the archaeological record comes in, alongside tantalizing but ambiguous textual references and later artistic depictions, which need to be treated with extreme caution, as they often reflect moralistic views or comedic exaggeration. The most direct evidence comes from archaeology, actual objects found that might have served this purpose. However, identifying such an object definitely as a dildo from centuries ago is incredibly challenging. A smooth piece of wood, a polished bone fragment, a leather form, these could have been handles for tools, weaving implements, pestles, or any number of other mundane objects. Without clear context, like finding it in a hollowed-out prayer book, which is the very scenario we're exploring, but archaeological finds are rarely that perfect. Their function is often open to interpretation. This brings us to the specific items found within hollowed-out books. The famous example often cited, and the one likely sparking this entire line of inquiry for you, involved what were described as phallic objects found in such contexts. Were they definitely dildos? The objects themselves, if preserved well enough to analyze, might show signs of wear consistent with use, but distinguishing sexual use from other kinds of handling can be difficult. The context of being hidden within a prayer book is the strongest piece of circumstantial evidence, suggesting a clandestine, highly personal, and likely forbidden purpose. It's not the kind of place you'd casually store a spindle or a spoon, right? Mainstream historical fact. While explicit evidence of dildos is scarce, representations of phallic symbols and artifacts with potential sexual uses do appear in various forms throughout medieval European history, often in contexts related to fertility cults, folklore, or as apotropaic, warding off evil, symbols. Stone carvings on churches, amulets, or small portable objects sometimes feature phallic shapes. However, these public or symbolic uses are distinct from the private, personal use of a dildo for pleasure, and the cultural meaning and intent behind these objects were complex and varied, often far removed from modern understandings of sexuality. This widespread presence of phallic imagery, even in sometimes unexpected places, suggests a cultural familiarity with the form, even if its private use was taboo. Historians still argue whether the objects found in hollowed-out books were exclusively dildos, or if some might have been other types of forbidden items or symbols with personal meaning, perhaps related to witchcraft beliefs, folk magic, or other practices frowned upon by the church. While phallic forms are often discussed, the exact nature and function of every object found in such a hidden compartment are not always definitively confirmed. Could some have been small effigies, charms, or other personal talismans? It's possible, though the context of being hidden in a prayer book still points strongly towards something deeply personal and needing utmost secrecy. The debate isn't just about whether any dildos were hidden, but whether all such finds represent dildos, or if the contents were more varied. A quirky or fringe tidbit. While we're trying to picture these things, let's consider what else medieval people used for personal comfort or hygiene that might have had interesting shapes. For instance, there are historical records and archaeological finds of small personal tools for ear cleaning, ear scoops, toothpicks, or items used for applying cosmetics or managing hair. These were often made of bone or metal and could be quite small and intricate. The point is, medieval people were capable of crafting small personal items for intimate purposes, even if those purposes were practical rather than pleasurable in the modern sense. It shows the technical skill existed to create objects like a dildo if someone desired one. It also highlights how easily a uniquely shaped personal object could be misidentified today if its original function isn't immediately obvious. Imagine future archaeologists digging up your bedside table and trying to figure out what your charging cable, a stray earbud, and that oddly shaped back scratcher were really for. Confusion is inevitable across centuries, so painting a clear picture of the typical medieval dildo hidden in a prayer book is impossible because there wasn't one. Each was likely a unique, perhaps crude, perhaps carefully crafted object born out of personal need and shaped by the materials at hand and the skill of its maker. It represents an act of ingenuity and defiance, a physical manifestation of a secret desire for pleasure or control in a world that denied both. The transition from thinking about the women to thinking about the object makes it all feel a little more concrete, doesn't it? Less abstract history, more someone actually carved this and hid it here. It gives you a sense of the very real human behind the historical curiosity. And that sense of the human, the individual desire and defiance, is key to understanding why someone would go to such lengths. So you've got a sense of the medieval world these women inhabited, a world demanding conformity and offering little private space. You've also started to visualize the object itself, likely a simple, handcrafted thing made of wood or bone, something discreet and personal. The question naturally arises then, in this world of scrutiny and limited privacy, where do you hide something so taboo, so deeply personal, and potentially so dangerous if discovered? Where do you secrete away this tangible piece of self-possession in a life that felt largely dictated by others? The answer, surprisingly or perhaps ironically, often leads us to books, specifically prayer books. Now think about medieval homes. They weren't exactly overflowing with clever storage solutions. No built-in wardrobes with secret panels, no under-the-bed drawers on smooth runners, certainly no self-storage units down the street. Living spaces were often communal, even for those with some means. People slept in the same rooms. Servants or family members were always around. Personal belongings were few and precious, often kept in chests or simple bags. Finding a place where something could be consistently and reliably hidden, safe from prying eyes during daily life, cleaning, or unexpected visits, was a significant challenge. Books, however, offered a unique solution. In the medieval period, owning a book was a sign of status, a luxury, and depending on the book, a marker of piety or learning. They weren't like the paperbacks cluttering your nightstand today. Medieval books, especially religious texts like Bibles, Psalters, or books of hours, personal prayer books, were often substantial objects. They were written or copied by hand, illuminated with intricate illustrations, bound in sturdy materials like wood covered with leather or fabric, sometimes adorned with metal clasps or even jewels. They were objects of value treated with respect, often passed down through generations. Because they were valuable and often used for private devotion, books were generally kept in safe, accessible places. On shelves in a study, if you were wealthy enough to have one, on a lectern, or perhaps kept in a chest or bag alongside other important possessions. Critically, they weren't typically moved around constantly or handled roughly by just anyone. A woman's personal prayer book especially would be hers, used in moments of private reflection or public worship. This relative stability and personal ownership made it a potentially ideal, if deeply ironic, hiding place. Think about the physical structure of these books. The bindings were thick and solid. The pages were made of parchment or vellum, treated animal skins, layered densely. There was often significant material in the covers themselves. This provided the physical potential to hollow out a space within the book, either within the thick covers or perhaps by creating a cavity in the dense block of pages near the spine, concealed when the book was closed. It would require careful work, of course, a steady hand and sharp tool to carve out a space large enough to fit a small object without compromising the integrity of the book too much. Especially the precious text itself. You wouldn't want to accidentally carve through the Lord's Prayer, would you? That would be awkward. The size of the cavity needed would depend on the object being hidden. Given the descriptions of potential medieval dildos we discussed, perhaps small and made of bone, or a folded piece of stuffed leather, the required space might not have been enormous, enough for an item a few inches long, perhaps an inch or two in diameter at its widest point. This could conceivably be carved into the cover or the edge of the page block of a substantial medieval tome without being immediately obvious. The genius of using a book as a hiding place, though, wasn't just the physical space it offered. It was the social camouflage. What object could be more innocent, more respectable, more indicative of virtue and piety than a prayer book? In a society where religious observance was central to daily life and public identity, a prayer book was an essential item for anyone of standing, particularly women, who were often expected to be exemplars of piety. Carrying or owning a prayer book signaled devoutness and adherence to Christian norms. No one would suspect that this symbol of spiritual devotion contained a forbidden object of physical pleasure. Imagine the scene. A woman is sitting quietly, perhaps in her chamber, perhaps in a public space, her prayer book open on her lap. To the outside world, she is engaged in pious reading, a picture of medieval feminine virtue, but hidden within the covers, secreted away from the judgmental eyes of society and the church, is something entirely different, something that represents her private desires and agency. The contrast between the outward appearance of piety and the hidden reality is stark, perhaps even a quiet act of rebellion in itself. It's the ultimate Trojan horse, a vessel of holiness concealing a symbol of earthly, unsanctioned pleasure. This choice of hiding place wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It was taking the very instrument meant to guide a woman towards spiritual focus, modesty, and the rejection of worldly desires, and repurposing it to safeguard a tool of personal, physical satisfaction. It's almost a defiant act, a reclaiming of personal space and autonomy, using the objects that were meant, in part, to enforce control. The prayer book becomes a sanctuary not just for the soul, but for the body and its desires, a secret garden of self within the walled fortress of religious expectation. Historians still argue whether the choice of a prayer book was primarily for practical reasons. They were common, often personal and sturdy, or if there was a deeper, perhaps even subversive, symbolic intent behind using a sacred object for such a profane purpose. Was it simply the best available hiding spot, or was there a conscious decision to place this symbol of pleasure in defiance within the very text that preached against such desires? It's difficult to know the individual motivations, of course, but the juxtaposition is powerful and certainly suggestive of more than mere convenience. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to books as hiding places in history. People have hidden all sorts of things in books throughout history, not just dildos. Smugglers have used hollowed-out books to transport jewels or microfilms. Spies have hidden messages or small gadgets in them. Political dissidents have used them to conceal banned literature. Even seemingly mundane items like letters, money, or small keepsakes have been tucked away between pages or inside bindings. This practice wasn't unique to medieval women or to sexual objects. It was a known method of concealment across different eras and for various purposes. The sheer volume and density of old books made them excellent, if sometimes impractical, secret compartments. Imagine trying to find a specific letter hidden in one volume among a whole medieval library, like finding a needle in a stack of parchment needles. Mainstream historical fact: books, particularly religious manuscripts, were highly valued possessions in the Middle Ages, representing significant investments of time, labor, and materials. Owning even one book, especially a personal prayer book, was a luxury largely limited to the wealthy elite, clergy, and some members of the burgeoning merchant class. Literacy rates varied widely, but owning a book didn't necessarily mean one could read it fluently, or at all, though personal prayer books were more likely to be used directly by their owners. The fact that these women owned books at all places them within a certain social stratum, likely noble women, wealthy widows, or women in religious orders who had personal property. This wasn't a practice accessible to every woman in the Middle Ages. It required access to and ownership of these precious objects. The act of hollowing out a book was itself a significant undertaking. It required discretion, a degree of manual skill, and access to tools. It risked damaging a valuable possession. It wasn't a casual decision. It implies a strong motivation, the need for privacy, pleasure, agency, and the deep desire to keep this part of one's life absolutely secret. The fact that this potentially involved altering a sacred text like a prayer book underscores just how compelling that motivation must have been, given the profound respect and even awe with which such objects were viewed. It shows that the desire for personal autonomy and pleasure could, for some women, override even the deeply ingrained religious conditioning of the age. They were literally carving out a space for themselves, not just physically in the book, but symbolically in a world that offered them very little space of their own. It's a powerful image, isn't it? The quiet rebellion contained within the pages of devotion. So you've pictured the hiding spot, this incredible discreet irony of a prayer book concealing something so profoundly personal and potentially illicit, but that only answers the where. The question that naturally surfaces next, the one that perhaps feels the most poignant and human, is why? Why would a woman in the Middle Ages, facing down the severe moral and religious restrictions of her time, risk so much to possess and use such an object? What void was being filled? What need was being met that the risk of eternal damnation and earthly shame was worth it? To understand that, you have to sink a little deeper into the realities of medieval female life, particularly within the confines of marriage. Imagine yourself in her shoes. Marriage in the Middle Ages was rarely, if ever, a matter of romantic love or personal compatibility as we might understand it today. For the vast majority of society, from the highest nobility to the lowliest peasant, marriage was an economic and social contract. It was about alliances, property transfer, securing family lines, and procreation. For a woman, her marriage was usually decided by her parents or guardians. You didn't choose your partner based on shared interests or witty conversation. You married the man whose family's land bordered yours, whose political connections were advantageous, or simply the one your father deemed suitable for solidifying his own position or ensuring the continuation of your family's estate. Once married, a woman's role was clearly defined, albeit with some variations depending on her social class. For aristocratic women, it often involved managing a large household, overseeing servants, potentially administering estates in her husband's absence, and most crucially, bearing children, especially male heirs. For peasant women, it meant working alongside their husbands in the fields, running the domestic side of a much smaller operation, and still, the fundamental expectation of procreation. Across all classes, the primary purpose of marital sex, at least in the eyes of the church and societal norms, was procreation. Pleasure, while not entirely forbidden, was secondary and often viewed with suspicion, especially female pleasure. A woman's sexuality was often seen as dangerous, needing to be contained within the bounds of legitimate marriage for the purpose of having children. This brings us to the core issue of sexual agency. In a medieval marriage, a woman had very little. Her body in many ways became the property of her husband and her family line, primarily as a vessel for reproduction. Marital relations were often framed as a duty. The husband had a right to his wife's body, and the wife had a duty to submit. While some theologians debated the wife's right to sex if her husband was denying it, as denying a spouse sex could lead them to sin, the concept of a wife initiating sex for her own pleasure or seeking sexual satisfaction independent of procreation or her husband's desire was largely outside the accepted framework of marital relations. You were expected to be fertile, submissive, and focused on the spiritual and domestic realms, not on your own physical desires. Now layer onto this the practical realities of medieval life. Husbands, particularly among the nobility or merchant classes, were often absent for extended periods. They might be away fighting in wars, attending court, managing distant properties, or traveling for trade. These absences could last for months, even years. What was a wife to do during this time? Her life continued, often burdened with significant responsibilities for running the estate or household, but without the physical presence of her husband. Peasant husbands might be away for shorter periods for seasonal work or market, but absence was a common factor across society. Beyond absence, there was the issue of the husband's physical or sexual capacity, or simply incompatibility. Not all medieval husbands were capable lovers, or even interested in frequent sexual activity, or perhaps they suffered from illness or impotence. Or maybe, frankly, they were just not very good at it. Just because marriage was about duty didn't mean human beings didn't experience desire, frustration, or a simple lack of fulfillment. Imagine being tied for life to someone with whom you had no chemistry, who was rarely present, or who was incapable or uninterested in providing you with physical intimacy. For a woman with her own natural desires, whatever they might be, this situation could be one of profound loneliness and physical frustration. This is where the need for a private solution emerges. If your only legitimate access to sexual release is through a husband who is absent, unwilling, or unable, and you have no other sanctioned outlets for your own desires, what do you do? Adultery carried immense risks: shame, potential violence, legal repercussions, and eternal damnation. Seeking pleasure outside marriage with another person was fraught with danger. For some women, finding a way to satisfy their own needs in the absolute privacy of their own space, or what little privacy they could carve out, using an object that only involved themselves became the only viable, albeit still risky, option. The idea that women might have sexual needs and desires independent of procreation has a complicated history within medieval thought. While some early Christian thinkers viewed female sexuality primarily as a dangerous temptation or a passive response to male desire, later medieval thought, influenced by figures like Thomas Aquinas, acknowledged that pleasure was a natural part of the sexual act for both sexes, and indeed some believed female pleasure was necessary for conception. However, this rarely translated into an acceptance of female sexual agency or pleasure-seeking outside of the procreative act within marriage. The dominant message remained one of restraint, modesty, and prioritizing spiritual over physical concerns. So for a woman to actively seek out and use an object purely for her own physical pleasure was stepping far outside the accepted boundaries, a quiet, personal rebellion against the strictures placed upon her body and desires. Think about the sheer isolation involved. This wasn't something you could discuss with friends, certainly not with your confessor. This was a secret kept locked away not just in a book, but in your heart and mind. The loneliness of needing something so fundamental, yet having to obtain and use it in utter secrecy must have been immense. It wasn't just about physical pleasure. It was about a woman finding a way to tend to her own needs, to experience something purely for herself, in a life where so much was dedicated to serving others, husband, family, God. It was a small corner of autonomy in a world that offered very little, a quirky or fringe tidbit. Medieval medical texts, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman ideas, sometimes discussed women's health in terms of humors and physical blockages. Some believed that a woman's sexual health could be negatively impacted by a lack of sexual activity, potentially leading to physical or mental ailments. While this wasn't an endorsement of female pleasure-seeking outside marriage, it does show that there was some recognition within certain medical frameworks that women had physical needs related to sex that went beyond simply being fertile. Perhaps this provided for some women with access to such knowledge a quasi-medical justification in their own minds for seeking release. It's a thought, anyway. Mainstream historical fact. Arranged marriages were the norm across most social strata in the Middle Ages. While consent of the individuals was sometimes legally required, especially later in the period, particularly for women, this consent was often given under significant family pressure. Love matches certainly happened, but they were the exception, not the rule, and the economic and social considerations of the families involved almost always trumped personal feelings when it came to choosing a spouse. This system meant that many, if not most women, entered into lifelong unions with men they barely knew, often with significant age gaps and with little control over the compatibility of the match. Historians still argue whether the existence of these objects points primarily to unmet sexual needs due to spousal absence or incapacity, or if they also represent a broader desire for female sexual autonomy and pleasure independent of the marital or procreative function. Were these tools of necessity for women starved of intimacy, or were they also tools of personal pleasure for women who simply desired it, regardless of their marital situation? The motives were likely complex and varied from individual to individual. It's hard to draw sweeping conclusions based on limited archaeological finds. Consider the psychological aspect. hiding something so taboo, so personal, within the very object that represents one's public virtue and religious devotion, a prayer book, is a fascinating paradox. It's an act that underscores the intense pressure to conform, but also the powerful, perhaps even desperate, need to create a private self. The weight of the prayer book in her hands, the rough texture of the cover, the smell of old parchment. All these sensory details become intertwined with the weight of the secret it holds. It's a constant, quiet reminder of the hidden part of her life, a duality she had to navigate every single day. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a portable confession and a portable sanctuary all in one. Imagine the flutter of nerves every time someone got too close to the book, or asked to borrow it, or when the priest came for a visit. Oh, my dear, still absorbed in your devotions? Yes, yes, she was, just not perhaps in the way he imagined. This need for a clandestine solution highlights the total lack of legitimate avenues for female sexual expression or satisfaction outside of marriage. And even within marriage, the focus was so heavily tilted towards procreation and male satisfaction that female pleasure was often neglected, ignored, or deemed less important. The dildo in the prayer book becomes a symbol of this repression, but also of a woman's resilience and ingenuity in finding a way, however hidden and risky, to claim some measure of control and pleasure for herself. It speaks volumes about the constraints placed upon medieval women and the quiet ways they might have pushed back against them, creating secret lives and secret spaces where they could be something other than what society dictated. It's a testament to the enduring human desire for intimacy, pleasure, and personal autonomy, even in the face of overwhelming social and religious pressure. The quiet click of the prayer book closing, the heavy thud as it's placed back on the shelf, a sound that signals not just the end of a prayer session, but the successful concealment of a radical, personal act of self-possession. You've stepped back, mentally closing that hollowed-out prayer book, letting the weight of its secret settle. The weight feels a little clearer now, the human desperation and quiet resilience behind such an act. But the journey doesn't end with understanding the potential motives. The real historical puzzle, the one that keeps archaeologists scratching their heads and whispering in damp, muddy trenches, is the question of when. When exactly were these objects being used? How widespread was their use? Answering these questions requires digging, literally and figuratively, and it turns out dating medieval dildos is, shall we say, challenging. Like trying to date someone who insists their age is just a number, but refuses to show their ID or tell you what decade they were born in. Frustratingly vague. Think about the items that typically survive from the Middle Ages. You find lots of pottery shards, sturdy stuff that fires hard and lasts for millennia. You find metal objects, buckles, tools, weapons, coins. You find stone architecture, glass fragments, occasionally well-preserved textiles in specific anaerobic, oxygen-free conditions. These are the things that form the backbone of our understanding of medieval material culture, because they simply don't disappear easily. They resist the relentless march of time, weather, and soil chemistry. Now consider the materials we believe these objects were likely made from. The examples found so far are primarily wood, often shaped with surprising skill, sometimes covered in leather. There might have been padding underneath that leather, perhaps made of cloth or even wool or straw. What do wood, leather, cloth, wool, and straw have in common? They are all organic materials. And organic materials, unless preserved under very specific, rare conditions, like being waterlogged in a bog or perhaps exceptionally dry in a desert, neither of which are typical conditions for most medieval archaeological sites in Northern Europe where many finds originate, tend to decompose. They rot. They become food for microorganisms, earthworms, and fungi. Over centuries, a beautifully carved piece of wood or a carefully stitched leather casing turns into, well, dirt. A slightly different patch of dirt, perhaps, but dirt nonetheless. Imagine finding a lump of vaguely shaped organic matter in an excavation layer. Is it a root? Is it a piece of discarded wood? Is it something else? Unless the shape is remarkably clear or it's found in a very specific context, identifying it as a deliberately crafted object, let alone its purpose, becomes incredibly difficult. You're not finding robust ceramic or metal artifacts. You're looking for things that actively want to return to the earth from which they came. It's a scavenger hunt where most of the clues have melted away. This inherent fragility of the materials means that the archaeological record for these objects is incredibly sparse. We have a handful of examples, primarily recovered from privy pits, medieval toilets, cesspits. And while finding something like this in a privy pit is highly suggestive, you're basically finding it in medieval refuse, discarded after use. It's still a tiny sample size compared to the millions upon millions of people who lived across Europe during the Middle Ages. These few finds might be needles in a global haystack, but they're needles made of hay that's mostly turned to compost. So how do you date the few examples you do find? If they're found in a sealed archaeological layer, you can date the layer itself. For example, if the privy pit was filled in and capped in the 14th century, anything found within it must be from the 14th century or earlier. If there are datable coins or specific styles of pottery within the same layer, that helps narrow down the time frame. Sometimes you can use radiocarbon dating on the organic material itself, but this requires specialized equipment and careful calibration, and it provides a range, a MIPOE likely between 1300 and 1450, rather than a precise year. And radiocarbon dating works best on uncontaminated samples, which can be tricky when you're dealing with something dug out of a medieval sewer. You don't want your results skewed by, shall we say, later biological contributions. The challenge is exacerbated by the lack of corroborating evidence from other sources. Medieval art, particularly devotional art, which is abundant, or even secular illustrations, doesn't tend to depict objects of this nature. Imagine commissioning a lovely illuminated manuscript and asking the scribe to include a little illustration of a lady with her prayer book accessory. Yeah, probably not happening. Written records are equally silent. You won't find treatises on the proper care and use of your medieval dildo, or inventories listing them among household goods. Any discussion of such items would have been confined to the absolute deepest, most private confidence, or perhaps whispered accusations in legal or ecclesiastical courts, none of which seem to have survived in a way that explicitly describes these objects. This silence in the traditional historical record is a major part of why these few archaeological finds are so significant, and also why dating them is so hard. They pop up like unexpected, slightly awkward guests at the historical party, with no invitation or clear arrival time. We can date the soil they were found in, but dating the object itself, and more importantly, understanding its period of peak use or prevalence, is incredibly tricky. Historians still argue whether the few objects found represent continuous use of such items throughout the medieval period, or if they were more common during specific eras, perhaps linked to changing social or economic conditions that led to more spousal absence or evolving attitudes towards female sexuality, however subtle those might have been. It's like trying to reconstruct the history of fidget spinners based solely on finding 3 broken plastic ones buried in separate landfills from different decades, with no photos, no commercials, no online reviews, and no one ever talking about them. You'd know they existed, and roughly when the landfill layers were active, but you'd have no idea if they were a massive craze or just something 3 people bought and immediately regretted. Another quirky tidbit: while direct depictions are rare, some historians have debated whether certain ambiguous objects shown in marginalia, the doodles and illustrations in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, or alluded to in satirical poetry, could potentially be interpreted as references to such items. However, these interpretations are highly speculative and often rely on double entendres or visual puns that are hard to definitively decode across centuries. It's the historical equivalent of seeing shapes in clouds and arguing about whether that one looks exactly like your Aunt Mildred. Maybe, but probably not intentionally. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the dating difficulty: the vast majority of everyday objects used by ordinary people in the Middle Ages were made from biodegradable materials. Wooden tools, leather shoes, wool clothing, wattle and daub houses, thatched roofs, these were the norms. The relative scarcity of these items in the archaeological record, compared to pottery and metal, is a constant challenge for understanding the lives of non-elite medieval people. The dildo just happens to be one of the more sensational examples of this wider phenomenon. The difficulty in dating these objects also stems from their likely method of production. These weren't mass-produced items from a factory. Obviously, it's the Middle Ages. They were likely crafted by individuals, perhaps skilled woodworkers or leather workers, or even by the users themselves. This means there isn't a standard style or design that evolves neatly over time, like pottery styles do, which helps archaeologists create typologies for dating. A hand-carved wooden object could have been made in the 13th century or the 15th century using very similar tools and techniques. Without a context that can be firmly dated, the object itself offers few clues. Its artisanal history, where every piece is unique, which is lovely for appreciating the craft, but terrible for chronological analysis. Imagine trying to carbon date a particularly sturdy stick you found in your backyard. You might get a general time frame, but good luck figuring out if it fell off the tree last year or a decade ago, or if it was a piece of someone's long-lost walking stick from a century back. Now imagine that stick was deliberately shaped for a private purpose and then tossed into a pit full of other rotting things. The dating puzzle becomes significantly more complex. The very nature of the object, intended for private, hidden use, also contributes to the lack of clear dating. Unlike a cooking pot or a piece of jewelry, which might be passed down, repaired, or modified in ways that leave archaeological traces or are mentioned in wills or inventories. A dildo was likely a singular personal item. When it was no longer needed or usable, or when its owner died, it would most likely be discreetly disposed of, probably in the most convenient waste receptacle available, the privy pit. This discreet disposal means it's less likely to be found in association with other items that could help date it, or in contexts like burials or house floors where other datable artifacts are common. It's found in the trash, and dating medieval trash heaps, while possible, often provides a broad period rather than a specific point in time. So while we can say with some certainty that these objects existed in the medieval period, thanks to the few examples we have, pinpointing their prevalence or specific periods of use remains an open question. Were they a consistent, quiet feature of medieval life for certain women across centuries? Or did their use wax and wane with specific social changes or economic conditions? Historians still argue about the extent to which these finds represent a continuous underlying reality versus being sporadic occurrences that happen to survive. The limited evidence leaves a lot of room for interpretation and debate. The simple wooden or leather object pulled from the earth carries immense weight, not just from the dirt clinging to it, but from the historical questions it raises. It challenges our assumptions about medieval morality, female agency, and private life, while simultaneously frustrating our attempts to place it neatly within a timeline. It's a tangible link to an intangible reality, a whisper from the past that refuses to give up all its secrets, keeping its exact age just as hidden as it once was in the pages of a prayer book. You hold it or look at the photos of it, and you feel the weight of the centuries, the decay, the deliberate secrecy that makes its history so elusive. It's a mystery wrapped in organic matter, buried in time. You've wrestled with the dating puzzle, mentally dusting off fragments and trying to place them in time, feeling the frustration of organic matter resisting your historical timelines. The scarcity of the finds and the difficulty in dating them underscore just how deeply hidden these objects were. And that brings us back to the original compelling image, the dildo concealed within a hollowed-out prayer book. It's a striking, almost jarring juxtaposition that begs the question, why that hiding place? Why desecrate or perhaps repurpose an object of profound religious significance for something so intensely private and, from the church's perspective, potentially sinful? Think about the world you're navigating in the Middle Ages, especially as a woman. Your life is structured by religion. The church is everywhere, in the rhythm of the day with prayer bells, in the calendar with feast days and fasts, in the rituals that mark birth, marriage, and death. For many women, particularly those of some means, a prayer book or book of hours wasn't just a casual possession. It was a central, cherished, and highly visible part of their lives. A book of hours was a personal devotional text containing prayers for the different canonical hours of the day, psalms, hymns, and often calendars of saints' days. Owning one was a mark of piety, literacy, or at least the ability to follow along, and status. These books could range from relatively plain, though still valuable texts to exquisitely illuminated manuscripts that were genuine works of art, commissioned by wealthy patrons. Carrying your prayer book, using it in church or during private devotion at home, was a public display of your faith and adherence to religious norms. It was an object that commanded respect and was unlikely to be casually rifled through by others, particularly men or those outside your immediate household, because it was sacred. So right there you have the primary practical reason: security and discretion. If you needed to hide something deeply personal, something that absolutely could not be discovered, where better to put it than inside the one object you carry regularly that everyone treats with reverence and respect? It's the medieval equivalent of hiding something embarrassing in a Bible on your bookshelf today. People just generally don't mess with Bibles. The prayer book offered an unparalleled level of privacy in a world where personal space was often limited and possessions were few and potentially subject to scrutiny. Imagine the scenario. You're a married woman, perhaps your husband is away on business, pilgrimage, or war for months, even years at a time. Or perhaps your marriage is loveless, or your husband is incapable or uninterested. You have desires, needs, and nowhere socially sanctioned to express them. You create or acquire this private object. Where do you keep it? Not under the mattress. Mattresses were often shared, and rooms even more so. Not in a chest. Chests were routinely accessed for clothing, linens, and other household items, and servants or family members might have keys or access. Not buried in the garden. Too risky, too inconvenient. But your prayer book? That's yours. It travels with you, and its very nature protects it from casual inspection. You could keep it by your bedside, carry it to church, even leave it on a table, and no one would think twice about its presence. Its holiness was its camouflage. This choice of hiding place also offers a layer of symbolic complexity that's fascinating to unpack. You're taking an object representing spiritual devotion and using it to conceal an object related to physical, even carnal, pleasure. On one level, this could be seen as deeply transgressive, a sacrilege. But on another level, perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps, for the women using these objects, their sexuality was not entirely separate from their spiritual lives, or at least their private needs were just as valid in their own minds as their public piety. It could represent a radical reclaiming of space and agency, using the very symbol of constraint and expected female virtue, the prayer book, to shield a tool for personal satisfaction and autonomy. It's a quiet act of rebellion, a hidden pocket of selfhood within the prescribed boundaries of medieval womanhood. A mainstream historical fact here is the immense cultural and religious authority of the church in medieval Europe. It shaped laws, dictated morality, and influenced every aspect of daily life, particularly for women who were often seen as more susceptible to sin and required strict guidance to achieve salvation. The emphasis was on chastity, obedience, and motherhood within the confines of marriage, or celibacy within a convent. Any sexual activity outside of marriage, or even within marriage, if not strictly for procreation, a complex and debated point among theologians, was viewed with suspicion or outright condemnation. This prevailing moral climate made the open possession or discussion of objects related to female sexual pleasure impossible for most women. The need for absolute secrecy wasn't just about personal preference. It was about avoiding severe social and potentially legal or ecclesiastical consequences. So, hiding such an object in a prayer book wasn't just clever. It was a direct response to the intense pressures of this moral environment. It was putting the forbidden right under the nose of the enforcers of morality, but in a way that made it invisible. It's like hiding your secret candy stash inside a box labeled broccoli. Nobody is ever going to look in there. Now consider the physical act of hollowing out a book. This wasn't a trivial undertaking, especially with medieval manuscripts. Paper was rare and expensive. Parchment or vellum, prepared animal skins, was the norm. These were thick, durable, and valuable materials. Cutting into a book made of vellum would have required effort and care, and it would have permanently altered a significant object. This suggests the object being hidden was important enough to warrant this effort and the sacrifice of a portion of the book's integrity. It speaks to the value placed on the dildo itself, not in monetary terms necessarily, but in terms of its importance for the owner's well-being or pleasure. The size and shape of the cavity would have been dictated by the object it was intended to hold, and the objects found or believed to have been used were not enormous. They were of a size that could be concealed and would fit comfortably within a book of reasonable dimensions. This consistency in the hiding place suggests a shared understanding, or perhaps even instructions being passed quietly between women about the most effective method of concealment. If you must have such a thing, sister, keep it in your prayer book. No one will dare look there. Could this practice have been widespread? Given the scarcity of finds, historians still argue whether the few examples found represent a common, albeit deeply secret, practice among medieval women of a certain class, or if they were incredibly rare and specific occurrences. The act of hollowing out a book is noticeable if you know what to look for, so perhaps only a few women were bold or desperate enough to try it. Or perhaps many more did it, and we just haven't found the evidence because the objects in the books have decomposed. It's another layer of the mystery. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to books in the Middle Ages. Medieval readers often interacted with their books in ways that seem unusual to us. They would write notes, glosses, and even doodle in the margins. Remember that marginalia point from section 9? They might press flowers or herbs within the pages. Books were handled, studied, and lived with. The idea of physically altering a book, while perhaps not for this specific purpose, wasn't entirely alien. However, hollowing one out for concealment is a distinct and much more significant alteration than adding a marginal note. The deliberate nature of the act, the careful hollowing out, the fitting of the object, speaks to intentionality. This wasn't a casual decision. It was a considered plan to integrate this secret object into the fabric of daily life, using the most trusted and least scrutinized item available as its guardian. The prayer book became a dual object, outwardly a symbol of piety, inwardly a sanctuary for private desire. This duality is profoundly medieval, a time when the sacred and the profane were often intertwined in complex ways, and public faith could be very different from private reality. Think about the weight of that book in your hands. It's heavy, substantial, perhaps bound in leather or wood. It feels serious, important, and hidden within its pages, a secret cavity, a hidden space for something entirely different. It's a physical manifestation of the hidden lives medieval women were forced to lead, a public performance of virtue and piety covering a private reality of unmet needs, personal desires, and quiet ingenuity. The prayer book, intended to guide the soul towards heaven, simultaneously housed a tool for earthly comfort and pleasure. The choice of a prayer book also says something about the women themselves. These were likely not women who had complete freedom to explore their sexuality or openly seek companionship outside of marriage. They were women operating within a highly restrictive social framework. Their access to education, travel, and independent means was limited. The prayer book represents their world, constrained, religiously framed, focused on domesticity and spiritual duties. The dildo within is a desperate, creative attempt to carve out a space for self, for pleasure, within those constraints. It's not found in a sword scabbard or a merchant's ledger. It's found in the repository of female piety and devotion. Could there also be a psychological aspect? Perhaps keeping the object within a prayer book offered some form of internal justification or compartmentalization. The sacredness of the book might have somehow lessened the perceived sinfulness of the object it contained, or at least allowed the owner to reconcile her spiritual life with her physical needs. Or perhaps it was simply the most practical choice in a world where practical options were scarce. The prayer book as a hiding place is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a window into the ingenuity and resilience of medieval women navigating a challenging world. It speaks volumes about the pressures they faced, the lack of acceptable outlets for their sexual lives, and their determination to find private solutions. It highlights the gap between the publicly prescribed life of a virtuous woman and the complex reality of her inner world. The image of the hollowed-out prayer book is powerful precisely because it encapsulates this tension so perfectly. It's a symbol of control and conformity used to shield an object of personal freedom and defiance. It's the ultimate secret compartment, leveraging the sacredness of the container so to protect the taboo nature of the contents. You hold the book, feel its weight, turn its pages, and you know there's a hidden history within, a story whispered not in words but in carved wood and concealed space. It's a quiet testament to the enduring human need for intimacy and satisfaction, found even in the most unexpected of places, protected by the most sacred of objects. The prayer book didn't just hide the object, it became part of its story, a silent accomplice in a private rebellion against a world that sought to deny women their own bodies and desires. You felt the weight of that prayer book in your hands. Imagine the careful clandestine act of hollowing out its precious pages, understanding why such a sacred object became the perfect, secure hiding place. Now let's shift our focus from the container to the contained, to the object itself that warranted such secrecy and such effort. What was it like? What was this tool for private pleasure, this quiet companion hidden within the outward display of piety? When we talk about dildos from the Middle Ages, especially those potentially linked to the scant archaeological evidence, you're generally looking at items made from organic materials. And the most likely candidate, the one that pops up most frequently in discussions and aligns with the few tentative findings, is wood. Wood was ubiquitous in the medieval world. It was used for everything: buildings, furniture, tools, utensils, even toys, though probably not this kind of toy, openly. It was readily available, could be worked with relatively simple tools, and could be shaped and smoothed. Imagine holding a piece of wood. It has a natural warmth, a grain pattern that tells the story of the tree it came from. Now imagine shaping that wood. A skilled hand with a knife or chisel could transform a simple block or branch into something quite different. These objects found or speculated upon aren't typically described as elaborately carved or artistic masterpieces. They were functional. You'd likely be looking at something relatively simple in form, perhaps a cylinder, maybe slightly tapered, smoothed down to avoid splinters. Think less ornate sculpture, more practical tool. The choice of wood matters too. Different woods have different properties. A hardwood like oak or beech would be durable, but perhaps harder to shape. A softer wood like pine might be easier to carve, but wouldn't last as long and could splinter more easily. What kind of wood would you choose if you were making something for intimate personal use? Something you wanted to be smooth, comfortable, and discreet. Something without a strong, telltale smell, perhaps? Historians still argue whether specific types of wood were preferred for certain objects based on texture, durability, or even symbolic meanings sometimes attached to trees. Would you pick a common, easily accessible wood, or something a bit finer if you could afford it? This wasn't exactly something you could pop down to the local woodworker's shop and order openly. Was it? Yes, good sir, could you fashion me a personal use implement? Make sure it's smooth. Awkward. So the craftsmanship could range widely. It might be a crude, self-made affair, perhaps fashioned by the woman herself or a trusted female confidant. Or it might have been made by someone with more skill, perhaps a wood-turner or carpenter who understood the request implicitly, or maybe even someone who specialized in discreet commissions. The level of finish would indicate the care taken. Was it just roughly whittled? Or was it sanded down painstakingly until it was smooth to the touch? A smooth surface is crucial for comfort, obviously. Medieval people knew how to smooth wood. They used abrasives like sand, or even rough leaves and plant materials, and then maybe polished it with wax or oil. Beyond wood, what other materials might have been used? Stone is possible, though much harder to shape into a smooth, non-abrasive form. Think of ancient stone phalluses found in some cultures. but those are often much older and cruder, or ceremonial. Shaping stone for this purpose in the Middle Ages would be difficult and conspicuous work. You'd need a stone carver, and again, explaining that commission. Just, a smooth, cylindrical garden ornament that fits in a book? Yeah, right. Leather is another possibility. It could be shaped, stuffed, and sewn. Perhaps a core object, like wood, could be covered in soft leather. This would provide a different texture, maybe softer, more yielding. Leather was widely used for all sorts of things: bags, belts, book bindings, clothing. A leather worker could certainly create such an object, but again, the discretion needed would be paramount. Imagine trying to describe the required shape and feel to a leather worker without raising suspicion. Make it supple and about this long and roundish for reasons. Horn or bone are less likely, but not impossible for smaller, less substantial objects. They can be shaped and polished, but working with them is also a specific skill. Glass? Forget it. Medieval glass blowing wasn't really up to creating solid, durable shapes for this purpose, and it would be incredibly fragile. Metal? Possible. Perhaps bronze or lead, but metalworking is noisy, and molten metal isn't exactly user-friendly for a discrete project. Also, a metal object would be heavier and potentially cold and uncomfortable. Given the materials readily available and the tools accessible to most people, or capable craftsmen operating discreetly, wood seems the most practical and likely choice for these personal items. A mainstream historical fact here is the highly developed state of woodworking crafts in medieval Europe. Carpenters, joiners, turners, and carvers were essential tradesmen, creating everything from timber-framed houses to intricate furniture and religious carvings. They had the skills and tools to shape wood with precision. So, picture this object. If it's wood, it would have a natural weight, feel solid but not heavy like stone or metal. It might have a faint scent of the wood itself, perhaps masked by whatever was used to smooth or finish it. The grain would be visible, perhaps swirling patterns if it was turned on a lathe, a process medieval woodworkers were quite familiar with. You might feel the slight imperfections, the tiny variations in texture that machine-made objects lack. This is a handmade thing, a product of human effort and intention, a quirky or fringe tidbit related to medieval materials. Before widespread sandpaper, medieval craftsmen used things like dried horsetail rushes, which have a naturally abrasive silica content for polishing wood. They also used shark skin, which is rough like sandpaper, for finishing surfaces. So achieving a smooth finish was possible, just perhaps more labor-intensive than today. Imagine using shark skin to smooth that. It gives a whole new meaning to getting the job done. The size would be limited by the hiding place, fitting inside a cavity hollowed out of a book, remember? That means they weren't enormous. We're likely talking about objects perhaps 4 to 7 inches long, maybe an inch or two in diameter. Something that could be concealed in a hand, tucked away quickly, and yes, fit comfortably within the carved-out space of a substantial book. This suggests a certain practicality in design. They were sized for their intended use, and their intended secrecy. How might they have been used? Well, you use them for pleasure, obviously. The private act of masturbation or self-exploration. In a world where a woman's sexuality was primarily viewed through the lens of procreation within marriage, and where accessing partners outside of marriage was fraught with danger, social ruin, violence, disease, an object like this offered a safe, solitary outlet for sexual desire. It was a way to experience pleasure without transgressing strict social and religious norms externally, even if using the object itself was considered sinful by the church. It provided agency over one's own body and pleasure in a system that sought to control both. Historians still argue whether the shape and form of these objects were primarily based on achieving comfort and pleasure, or if they were also sometimes shaped to resemble male anatomy, perhaps as a substitute for a male partner. The archaeological record is too sparse and the objects too varied or theorized to give a definitive answer. Some finds suggest simple, non-anatomical shapes, while others hint at more phallic forms. The texture would be important. If it was wood, was it left bare? Or was it perhaps wrapped in a soft cloth, like silk or linen, maybe covered in a fitted leather sheath? Imagine the different sensations. Smooth, bare wood, wood wrapped in soft, cool linen, wood encased in supple leather. And lubrication? Medieval people used various oils, olive oil, almond oil, animal fats. And of course, saliva is always readily available and free. So there were ways to make the experience more comfortable and pleasurable, even with simple materials. Think about the context of use, not something you'd necessarily use during the day when servants or family members might be around. Likely a private moment, behind a closed door, perhaps in bed at night, the prayer book its silent sentinel nearby. The ultimate act of me time in the Middle Ages, hidden away from the world. It required not just physical concealment, but mental compartmentalization, tucking away this private aspect of self from the demands of public life and religious expectation. This object, whatever its material or exact shape, represents a profound act of self-care and self-possession in a restrictive environment. The minds. It's a testament to the fact that human needs and desires find ways to manifest, regardless of societal constraints. The ingenuity lies not just in what was created, but how it was hidden and integrated into a life dictated by other forces. The sensory experience of using such an object would have been entirely private. The feel of the material against the skin, the rhythm of use, the focus inward. No external partner, no social entanglement. Just a woman and her hidden object. It's a stark contrast to the communal nature of much of medieval life. Privacy as we understand it was a luxury, often non-existent. Bedrooms were frequently shared spaces, houses bustling with family and servants. Finding a moment of true solitude, physical and mental, would have been challenging. And yet, these objects and their hiding places suggest women found a way. Could these objects have been mass-produced in some way? Unlikely, given the need for secrecy. Any sort of workshop churning out personal items would attract unwanted attention very quickly. This feels more like bespoke creation, either homemade or commissioned from someone who could be absolutely trusted, perhaps a discreet craftsman known through a network of similarly inclined women. Imagine the hushed conversations, the careful descriptions given, the exchange of coin hidden in a hand. The presence of such objects, even the few speculated ones, challenges the simplistic view of medieval women as purely passive figures defined solely by their roles as wives, mothers, or nuns. It reveals a hidden interior life, a recognition of personal needs, and a determination to meet them, even if it meant navigating a complex world of secrecy and potential shame. The material object becomes an artifact of this hidden world, speaking volumes through its very existence and concealment. Think of the texture again. Wood polished smooth, maybe slightly warm from being handled, or the potential softness of leather, worn smooth with use. These weren't cold, sterile items. They were personal, intimate objects, likely handled with care and kept safe precisely because of their importance to the owner. They weren't just tools. They were companions in a world that offered few avenues for female sexual expression and autonomy. The debate among historians about the prevalence and nature of these objects is a reflection of the difficulty of finding evidence for such deeply private practices. Unlike, say, agricultural tools or weapons, these items weren't left lying around or buried openly. They were hidden, cherished, and likely disposed of carefully when no longer needed or when discovery was feared. Their fragility, especially wood and leather, also means they are less likely to survive centuries in the ground compared to pottery or metal. So when you picture that hollowed-out prayer book, the object nestled inside wasn't necessarily a gleaming, machine-perfect creation. It was likely something more organic, perhaps handmade, perhaps a little imperfect, but carefully crafted and smoothed. A piece of the natural world, shaped by human hands, used to bring private pleasure in a world dictated by divine rules and social constraints. It's a tangible link, however tenuous, to the hidden desires and quiet resilience of medieval women, tucked away where no one would ever dare look. It feels like touching a secret. You've handled the object in your mind, felt its texture, understood its quiet purpose, a secret nestled within another secret. But what happens if that secret comes tumbling out? What happens if someone else finds it? The thought alone would have sent a jolt of pure terror through any woman who possessed such an item. Discovery wasn't just inconvenient, it could unravel her entire life. Imagine the scenario. You've used the object, tucked it back into its hollowed-out sanctuary within the prayer book, and placed the book back on its shelf or beside your bed. Everything seems secure. Then someone enters, perhaps a servant cleaning your room, tidying up. Perhaps a curious child rummaging through your things. Perhaps your husband reaching for the very book you hold so dear for its outward piety. Your heart leaps into your throat. You watch, frozen, as their hand approaches the book. The moment they pick it up, a cold dread washes over you. Do they handle it strangely? Does it feel heavier or thicker than it should? Do they perhaps open it idly, flipping through the pages, unaware of the hidden cavity? Or worst of all, do they know exactly what they're looking for? Did someone betray you? Did you leave a clue, a smudge of oil, a misplaced page? The consequences of discovery depended heavily on who did the discovering. If it was a trusted female friend or confidant, perhaps someone who understood or even shared similar needs, the consequence might be embarrassment mixed with relief. The secret is known, but perhaps shared and understood. But that was the absolute best-case scenario and incredibly risky. If a servant found it, the danger was immense. Servants in medieval households were necessary, but also part of the social hierarchy that kept tabs on everyone. Gossip was a potent force, and a servant with knowledge of such a private and scandalous secret held immense power. They could whisper it to other servants. It could spread through the household like wildfire, and from there, out into the wider community. Your reputation, painstakingly built on outward conformity and piety, could be shattered in an instant. Imagine the snickers, the sidelong glances, the judgment. You, the seemingly devout wife or single woman, revealed to have a hidden, unnatural vice. It's like finding your boss's extremely embarrassing search history, but instead of just losing your job, you lose your entire social standing. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. If your husband discovered it, oh boy, this is where things get truly perilous. Medieval society, while varied, generally placed men, particularly husbands, in authority over women. A husband discovering such an object might see it as a profound betrayal, a sign of a wife's uncontrollable lust, independence, or even infidelity. Though that doesn't quite fit here, the idea of sexual activity outside the marital bed was the core issue. He might feel humiliated, believing it reflected poorly on him as a provider or partner. His reaction could range from furious anger and verbal abuse to physical violence. He might confiscate the object, destroy it publicly or privately. He might impose harsh restrictions on your life, watch your every move, ban you from social gatherings. In extreme cases, depending on the local laws and customs and the severity with which such crimes were viewed, it could even lead to separation or pressure for an annulment, though that was complex and usually required more than just this kind of transgression. A mainstream historical fact here is that medieval marriage was often viewed as a contract, sometimes with property implications, and while divorce as we know it was rare, annulments or separations could occur under specific, church-sanctioned circumstances, often related to non-consummation or prohibited degrees of kinship. But female sexual misconduct outside the bounds of marriage was certainly grounds for severe repercussions within the marriage itself. The discovery by a religious figure, like a priest during confession, or even a neighbor who reported you, would bring down the full weight of the church. The church had very clear views on sexuality, largely confined to procreation within marriage. Any other form of sexual activity, including masturbation, was considered a sin, often listed among the sins of the flesh. Confession was mandatory, and withholding such a significant sin would be considered a grave offense. Imagine confessing this, sitting in the confessional, whispering to the priest about your secret object and your private acts. The priest's reaction would likely be one of shock, disapproval, and a stern lecture on the dangers of lust and the devil's temptations. Your penance would likely be severe. It could involve fasting, extra prayers, charitable works, or even public shaming. Public penance could be humiliating. Standing outside the church door wearing a sackcloth, for example, or being forced to make a public confession before the congregation. Your private shame becomes a public spectacle. Historians still argue whether clerical responses to female sexuality were uniformly harsh, or if there was variation depending on the individual priest, the community, and the perceived repentance of the woman. Some argue that while the official doctrine was strict, pastoral practice might have been more lenient in some cases, perhaps focusing on prayer and spiritual guidance rather than outright condemnation, especially if the woman was genuinely contrite. Others point to harsh penitential manuals and sermons as evidence of the church's rigid stance. The object itself, the dildo, if discovered by a religious authority, might be viewed with horror, possibly even as a tool of the devil. It would certainly be confiscated and destroyed, perhaps even ritually burned. The prayer book, its sacred pages desecrated by being hollowed out and used as a hiding place for such an item, would likely be seen as doubly offensive, a sacrilege compounding the personal sin. It's like hiding contraband in a Bible and getting caught by a very strict Sunday school teacher. The punishment is going to be extra bad just for where you hid it. Beyond the immediate household and religious authorities, the community consequences were devastating. Medieval communities were often tight-knit, and reputation was everything, particularly for women. A woman's honor and chastity or appearance thereof were tied to her family's standing. Discovery of this secret could ruin her marriage prospects if she was single, or bring shame upon her husband and family if she was married. She might be ostracized by other women, feared as a bad influence, whispered about whenever she passed by. Children might be told to stay away from her. Her social circle would shrink dramatically. In a time when social connections were crucial for survival and well-being, this isolation would be a profound punishment in itself. It's the medieval version of being canceled, but with potentially lifelong consequences and no internet forum to complain on. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit related to medieval sexual norms and punishments. While this particular scenario is hard to find direct documentation for in legal or church records, precisely because the act was private and the objects hidden, medieval law codes and church penitentials are full of fascinating, sometimes bizarre punishments for sexual transgressions. For instance, some penitentials prescribe specific numbers of days or years of fasting on bread and water for various sexual sins, ranging from a few days for lustful thoughts to years for adultery or other acts considered more severe. Others involve pilgrimages or wearing specific garments. Imagine a penance for this. Thou shalt recite 500 Hail Marys and carry a wooden object shaped like, well, through the town square. Highly unlikely, but the range of medieval punishments for sexual matters is quite broad and often focused on public shame and physical deprivation. The fear of discovery would have been a constant companion for any woman possessing such an object. Every knock on the door, every unexpected visitor, every time someone looked at her prayer book might trigger a wave of panic. The need for secrecy wasn't just about avoiding abstract punishment. It was about preserving her safety, her social standing, her family's honor, and her very way of life. Think about the mental toll of living with this secret, the constant vigilance, the planning needed to find moments of solitude, the anxiety about potential discovery. It's not just the act itself that was hidden, but the emotional weight of carrying the secret. This adds another layer to our understanding of these objects. They weren't just tools for pleasure. They were artifacts of a complex inner life lived under the shadow of potential condemnation. The act of hiding the object within a prayer book, a symbol of piety and conformity, takes on an even deeper significance when considering the risk of discovery. It's an act of defiance, yes, but also an act of profound vulnerability. The place of greatest safety from the outside world was also the place of greatest danger, from detection by religious authority or a pious household member. The irony is thick enough to cut with a medieval butter knife. So while the object itself offered private pleasure and agency, its existence placed the woman in a state of perpetual risk. The quiet satisfaction of meeting her own needs was balanced against the ever-present fear of the catastrophic fallout if her secret was revealed. It's a stark illustration of the constraints placed upon medieval women's lives and the lengths they might go to carve out even a small space for personal autonomy and physical satisfaction. The historical silence on this specific practice, dildos hidden in prayer books, underscores the effectiveness of the secrecy. The lack of widespread records about women being punished for this specific act doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. It could just mean the hiding was so successful that discovery was rare. Or it could mean that when discovery did happen, the matter was dealt with privately within the family or household, rather than becoming a public legal or church record. Historians still argue whether the lack of direct evidence means the practice was extremely rare or simply extremely well concealed and dealt with discreetly when found. Regardless of prevalence, the impossibility of discovery and its dire consequences adds a layer of tension and bravery to the story of these objects. Owning one wasn't a casual choice, it was a calculated risk, taken for the sake of personal well-being and pleasure in a world that offered few legitimate avenues for female sexual expression beyond the confines of procreative marriage. Consider the fear, the physical symptoms of it, the sudden cold sweat, the racing pulse, the feeling of blood draining from your face, the trembling hands as you try to casually close the book and put it away before the other person notices. It's not abstract, it's a visceral, physical reaction to the proximity of disaster. This fear was a constant companion to the hidden object. The story of these hidden dildos isn't just about medieval sexuality, it's about privacy, secrecy, risk, and the human need for pleasure and autonomy in the face of oppressive social structures. It's about the quiet courage it took to create a private space for oneself, literally and figuratively, and the immense peril involved in protecting that space. The potential consequences of discovery underscore the radical nature of the act itself, turning a seemingly mundane object into a symbol of defiance and a source of profound vulnerability. So you're standing there, metaphorically speaking, holding this prayer book. You know that books were sometimes hollowed out for hiding things, and you know a prayer book was a significant object. But now the big reveal. What exactly were these things, these objects that sparked such speculation? What was found tucked away inside these sacred volumes, hidden behind a veneer of piety and prayer? Well, the discoveries, while not massively widespread, let's not imagine every other prayer book had a secret compartment, were significant enough to grab attention when they surfaced. One of the most famous examples often cited in discussions about this topic involves an object found inside a 16th century prayer book. Now, while technically slightly post-medieval, depending on your definition, the lines get blurry around 1500, the context and implications are deeply rooted in the late medieval world and the evolving social landscape. This particular book, a beautifully bound volume, was found to have a carefully carved out compartment within its pages. And inside, an object made of wood. Think about that moment of discovery. Someone, perhaps a librarian, an archivist, a collector, or even a researcher, is examining an old book. They notice something odd. Maybe the pages feel slightly loose in the middle, or the weight seems off, or perhaps there's a visible seam or line on the edge of the text block. Curiosity piqued, they investigate further. They carefully open the cover, maybe separate a few glued together pages and reveal the cavity, and nestled within lies an object. Now, the description of these objects is where the careful historical work and the polite academic debate comes in. The objects are typically described as being made of wood, often turned or shaped, sometimes elongated, sometimes more rounded. They vary in size. Some are small enough to fit comfortably in the palm of your hand. Others are larger. They often show signs of wear, suggesting they were used. And their shape is what has led to the rather sensational interpretation. Many of them have a distinct, shall we say, phallic shape. This is where you have to engage your historical imagination, but also your critical thinking. What do people hide? Things that are valuable, things that are forbidden, things that are private. In the context of medieval life, especially for women, what fits those categories? Money, jewels, letters from a lover, perhaps something related to folk magic or superstition. or something related to personal pleasure or anatomy. The scholarly argument, the part that historians still argue whether these objects were definitely used as dildos, stems from the fact that identifying the precise function of many historical objects is incredibly difficult. We don't have instruction manuals for most things from the 15th or 16th century. We have the objects themselves, sometimes depictions in art, though those are often allegorical or symbolic, and occasionally textual references which might use obscure language or slang. So you find a shaped piece of wood inside a woman's prayer book. What could it be? Could it be a religious artifact? Perhaps a piece of a saint's staff shaped and kept for devotional purposes? Unlikely, given the typical forms of relics and devotional objects. Could it be some kind of tool? What kind of tool would a woman hide in her prayer book that is shaped like that? A small pestle for grinding pigments for illuminating manuscripts? Maybe, but again, the shape isn't typical for that, and hiding it in a prayer book is odd. Could it be a stopper for a bottle? Possible, but why this specific shape, and why in this location? The most compelling interpretation, and the one that has captured public imagination, is that these objects were indeed intended for sexual pleasure. Their shape strongly suggests this function, aligning with what we understand about the design of sex toys across various cultures and time periods. The fact that they were hidden suggests they were private and potentially illicit, something that a respectable woman of the era would not want discovered, especially by her husband, her family, or religious authorities. And hiding it in a prayer book provides the ultimate cover, an object associated with piety and moral uprightness. Think about the sheer cheekiness of it, attending church or praying privately at home with your personal pleasure device tucked away in the very book you're using to communicate with God. It's a level of compartmentalization that is almost breathtaking. It speaks to a private life lived completely separately from the public performance of piety and social expectation. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to these discoveries is that while the wooden phallic objects are the most sensational finds, other unusual items have also occasionally been found tucked away in the hollowed compartments of old books, sometimes alongside other things. These range from locks of hair, love tokens, small pieces of jewelry, or even what appear to be bundles of protective charms or herbs. This reinforces the idea that these compartments were used for storing things that were deeply personal, significant, or secret to the owner. The prayer book became a portable, personal safe for the most private aspects of a woman's life. A mainstream historical fact to consider here is the increasing availability of wood-turning technology during the later medieval and early modern periods. Wood-turning, the process of shaping wood on a lathe, allowed for the creation of smooth, symmetrical, and complex shapes relatively efficiently. This technology was used to create everything from furniture legs and bowls to spindles and decorative finials. The objects found in the prayer books often show evidence of being made using such techniques, suggesting they were not necessarily crude, hastily made items, but objects crafted with some skill, perhaps by a local artisan, or even by someone within the household who possessed the necessary tools and abilities. This points to them being deliberately manufactured objects, rather than just randomly shaped pieces of wood. Consider the sensory details of such an object. If you were to hold one today, carefully, in a museum collection, of course, it would likely feel smooth from age and use, the wood perhaps darkened with time and oils from repeated handling. There might be faint tool marks visible if you look closely, testament to its creation. The weight would feel solid, substantial. It wouldn't feel like a random twig. It would feel like an object made with purpose. Historians still argue whether the presence of these objects necessarily indicates widespread use among medieval women, or if these were rare, isolated instances representing a very specific need or personality. Were these objects commonly available? Were they openly discussed? Or were they something clandestine even among close female friends? The evidence is tantalizing but sparse. We have a few objects found in a few books. This doesn't give us statistics on how many medieval women owned such items or how they were acquired. It provides a fascinating glimpse into the possibility of such a private life, but doesn't confirm it was the norm. The debate also touches on the interpretation of the objects themselves. While the phallic shape is undeniable in many examples, could they possibly have had an alternative, non-sexual use that is not immediately obvious to us today? It's a question scholars must ask to avoid imposing modern interpretations onto historical artifacts. However, given the location of concealment, hidden within a deeply private object like a prayer book, and the striking resemblance to objects known to be sex toys in other historical contexts, the sexual interpretation remains the most compelling and widely accepted among those who have studied these finds. So the picture solidifies. You have medieval women navigating a world of strict social and religious expectations, for whom prayer books were central to their lives. And within some of these very books, objects strongly suggestive of sexual aids are found, hidden away. This wasn't just hiding secrets. This was hiding intensely personal secrets in the most unlikely, yet perhaps most secure of places. It forces us to rethink our assumptions about the private lives of medieval women and the extent to which they might have sought personal pleasure, even within the confines of a seemingly rigid society. The next step is to delve deeper into why this was necessary and what it tells us about their world. So you've uncovered the secret compartment. You've seen the object hidden within, a carefully shaped piece of wood, undeniably suggestive of a dildo, tucked away inside the most sacred of personal possessions, a prayer book. You've processed the initial shock, the wry amusement at the sheer audacity, the unexpected glimpse into a private world centuries distant. Now the question twists itself into a knot in your mind. Why? Why would a medieval woman need or want such an object, and why go to such extraordinary lengths to hide it? To understand the why, you have to steep yourself, just for a moment, in the complex and often contradictory world medieval women inhabited. Imagine yourself in their shoes, wrapped in layers of wool and linen, the air often thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Your life wasn't your own in the way we think of it today. For most women, their destiny was largely determined by their social status, their family, and perhaps most significantly, the dominant religious and societal norms dictated by the church and patriarchal structures. Marriage wasn't primarily about love or personal fulfillment. It was an economic and social contract. You were married off by your father or male guardian, often at a young age, to secure alliances, transfer property, or improve the family's standing. Your husband became your legal master. His word was law within the household. Your duties were typically centered around managing the home, bearing children, and upholding the family's reputation. Sexual relations within marriage were viewed by the church primarily through the lens of procreation. Pleasure wasn't necessarily forbidden, but it certainly wasn't emphasized. And non-procreative sex, even within marriage, could be seen as sinful. Outside of marriage, forget about it. Unsanctioned sexual activity, particularly for women, carried severe social stigma and potential legal or religious penalties. Consider the realities of these marriages. Maybe you were married to an older man, or a man you didn't find attractive, or perhaps a man who was simply a terrible lover. Because let's be honest, bad sex is not a modern invention. Even if medieval dating advice like, just avoid getting stabbed, seems quaint now. What if your husband was frequently away? Merchants traveled, knights went on campaigns or crusades, landowners visited distant properties. Weeks, months, even years could pass without a husband's presence. What if he was infertile or abusive, or simply uninterested in physical intimacy? A woman had very few options in such a situation. Divorce was incredibly difficult to obtain and rare, essentially requiring an annulment based on specific, hard-to-prove grounds. Separation was also complex and didn't free you to pursue other relationships. You were, for all intents and purposes, stuck. Now layer onto this the societal expectation of female chastity and piety. A respectable woman was expected to be modest, obedient, and devout. Her focus should be on spiritual matters and the running of her household. Openly expressing sexual desire or seeking sexual fulfillment outside the confines and often limitations of her sanctioned marital duties was highly frowned upon, if not actively condemned. This created an immense pressure cooker of conflicting forces, natural human desires versus strict social and religious constraints. This is where the hidden objects slot into the picture. If a woman was in a marriage lacking physical intimacy, or if she was unmarried, perhaps a widow, or a woman who never married but wasn't in a convent, or even if she simply desired pleasure for its own sake, a concept that was not widely acknowledged as a legitimate female need by the dominant culture, where could she turn? Masturbation, while not explicitly forbidden in the same way as adultery by medieval canon law, which focused more on actions involving two people, was still generally viewed with suspicion and associated with broader concepts of lust and solitary vice in moral treatises. It was certainly not something you'd openly discuss or admit to. So, if you're a medieval woman navigating these waters, maybe your husband's off fighting dragons, or more likely, French knights, or maybe he's just not interested, or perhaps you're a widow with no prospect of remarriage, but you still have needs and desires. What do? You can't exactly pop down to the medieval equivalent of Boots the Chemist and browse the personal care aisle. Any object you might use for self-pleasure would have to be something you procured discreetly, and crucially, something you could hide effectively. And what better hiding place than the one object you were not only permitted, but expected to have and use frequently, often in private devotional moments? Your prayer book. It was your connection to the divine, your tool for piety, your portable spiritual shield. No one would question why you had it with you. No one would think to look inside it, beyond the pages of psalms and prayers. It was the perfect camouflage for a secret, private life. The irony is almost palpable. Seeking carnal pleasure, using an object concealed within the very symbol of spiritual devotion and renunciation of worldly desires. It's like hiding your favorite contraband snacks in a box of kale. Nobody's ever going to look there. A quirky or fringe tidbit that adds another layer to this is the existence of medieval medical texts that discuss female anatomy and even acknowledge female sexual pleasure, sometimes in surprisingly frank ways, albeit often within the framework of explaining conception or diagnosing ailments. Some texts even suggested that female pleasure was necessary for conception to occur, a belief that lingered from ancient medicine. While these texts weren't necessarily widely read by the general populace, and certainly didn't translate into a societal acceptance of female sexual autonomy, their existence indicates that the idea of female pleasure wasn't completely alien to medieval thought, even if it was largely suppressed or ignored in public discourse and religious teaching. This suggests that perhaps some women were aware, through hushed conversations or folk knowledge, that pleasure was a possibility they were missing out on, fueling the desire to seek it privately. Historians still argue whether the discovery of these few objects represents a widespread practice among medieval women of various social classes, or if they were incredibly rare, used only by a small number of women under very specific circumstances. Were these dildos relatively accessible, perhaps made by local woodturners who didn't ask too many questions? Or were they difficult to obtain, perhaps commissioned discreetly, or even self-made? Without more finds or clearer textual evidence, it's hard to say how common this practice was. It's possible these examples are just the tip of an iceberg of hidden female sexuality, or they might be fascinating anomalies. Another mainstream historical fact that sheds light on the pressures medieval women faced is the sheer emphasis placed on virginity before marriage and fidelity within it. For women of noble or wealthy status, their virginity was a crucial asset, directly impacting their marriage prospects and the honor of their family. Once married, their fidelity was paramount, essential for ensuring the legitimacy of heirs. This intense scrutiny and control over female bodies and sexuality meant that any deviation, any private exploration of desire, had to be undertaken with extreme caution and secrecy. A hollowed-out prayer book wasn't just a hiding place for an object. It was a vault for a forbidden piece of identity and experience. Think about the sensory experience again. The smooth, cool wood of the object, perhaps feeling distinctly different from the rough, aged paper of the prayer book. The weight of the book in your hands, familiar from countless hours of prayer, now carrying a secret burden. The smell of old parchment and ink mingling with, well, whatever smells might have clung to a well-used personal item from centuries past. It grounds the historical concept in a tangible, almost intimate reality. The motivation wasn't just about seeking pleasure either. It could also be a quiet act of rebellion, a reclaiming of agency over one's own body and desires in a world that sought to control them completely. In a life where so many choices were made for you, who you married, where you lived, how you spent your days, this tiny, hidden object represented a sphere of private control, a moment of personal sovereignty, however small and secret. It was a way of saying, my body is my own, and I will seek my own comfort and pleasure, even if society forbids it. It's the medieval equivalent of having a secret stash of chocolate under your bed, but with significantly higher stakes and a lot more existential weight. It's also important not to project modern ideas about sex and relationships onto the past entirely. We can't assume medieval women thought about pleasure or autonomy exactly as we do. Their understanding was shaped by their own cultural context, their religious beliefs, and their daily experiences. But the basic human drives for intimacy, comfort, and pleasure are arguably timeless. And finding objects specifically shaped for sexual use, hidden in the most private of places, suggests that these drives were present and seeking expression, even under intense constraint. The hiding place itself speaks volumes. It wasn't just a random box or a hole in the floor, it was the prayer book. This suggests not only maximum security, but perhaps also a complex relationship with faith and morality. Was there guilt associated with using the object? Were prayers offered before or after its use? Or was the prayer book seen simply as the most practical, least suspected place, the ultimate hide in plain sight? Historians still argue whether the choice of the prayer book hiding spot held deeper symbolic meaning for the women. Beyond mere practicality, perhaps related to compartmentalizing their spiritual and physical lives, or even a form of cognitive dissonance. The sheer ingenuity of it is striking. In a world without readily available adult stores or online shopping, acquiring and concealing such an item required resourcefulness. It wasn't something you could casually pick up. It had to be made, perhaps by someone discreet, or even fashioned by the woman herself if she had the skills and tools, which would be unusual but not impossible depending on her status. This adds another layer of deliberate action and determination to the narrative. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. It required planning and effort. So you have this picture forming, a medieval woman constrained by societal rules, possibly in an unfulfilling marriage or without a partner, seeking a private source of comfort or pleasure. She obtains a discreetly made object and hides it in the one place that is consistently personal and unlikely to be searched, her prayer book. It's a powerful image of resilience and the enduring human need for intimacy and pleasure, even in the face of overwhelming external control. It reminds us that behind the grand narrative of the narratives of kings, queens, and religious movements, there were individual lives with their own desires, secrets, and clever strategies for navigating a difficult world. This quiet act of concealment in a holy book reveals more about the intimate realities of medieval women than countless official documents. It sets the stage for considering what these findings really tell us about the past and how they continue to resonate today. So you've made this incredible journey. You started with the mundane, the idea of boring history for sleep, and ended up peering into the most intimate, secret corners of medieval women's lives. You've sat in dusty archives, you've walked through ancient streets, you've felt the weight of a prayer book in your hands, and you've contemplated the quiet defiance hidden within. What does it all mean? What does this tiny carved piece of wood, tucked away for centuries, truly tell us about the past? It tells us, first and foremost, that history is never as simple or as clean as the official records make it seem. We often learn about the grand narratives, the kings, the queens, the wars, the major religious movements, the decrees of the church. We read about how society should have functioned according to the rules set by those in power. But these hidden objects, these unexpected archaeological finds, they pull back the curtain on the messy, complicated, deeply human reality of daily life. They show us that individuals, even within the most restrictive societies, found ways to assert their agency, to seek comfort, to pursue pleasure, and to carve out private spaces for themselves. The discovery of dildos in medieval contexts particularly in such a symbolically charged location as a prayer book, forces us to reconsider our assumptions about medieval women. We often picture them solely as passive figures, defined by their roles as daughters, wives, mothers, or nuns, their lives entirely dictated by patriarchal authority and religious doctrine. And while those forces were undeniably powerful and shaped their existence profoundly, these finds suggest a hidden layer of complexity, desire, and resourcefulness. It reminds us that behind the stereotypes were women with inner lives, with physical needs, and with the ingenuity to meet those needs in secret. It also highlights the concept of historical silence. So much of what we know about the past comes from written sources, legal documents, religious text, chronicles, letters, mostly created by men and often by men of privilege. The voices and experiences of ordinary people, and particularly women, are frequently missing or only appear filtered through the perspectives of others. Material culture, like the objects we've discussed, can sometimes speak when written sources are silent. It provides a tangible link to lives that otherwise leave little trace in the historical record, offering glimpses into private worlds that official history often overlooks or actively suppresses. The fact that these objects were hidden in prayer books is perhaps the most poignant detail. It wasn't just about concealment, it was concealment within the very symbol of medieval female virtue and piety. This juxtaposition speaks volumes about the conflicting pressures medieval women faced. Expected to be devout and chaste, they simultaneously navigated natural human desires. The prayer book became a vessel for this duality, containing both the spiritual path they were expected to follow and the private needs they sought to fulfill. It's a potent metaphor for the compartmentalization required to survive in a world of such stringent moral and social control. It's like keeping your most scandalous secrets in your journal, where everyone knows you write your deepest thoughts. Just daring someone to look, but knowing they probably won't because it's too obvious. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the increasing emphasis on individual piety and personal devotion during the later Middle Ages, particularly among lay people. This led to a greater ownership and use of personal devotional objects, like prayer books, psalters, and books of hours. These items were deeply personal possessions, used in private moments of prayer and reflection, making them ideal hiding places for items that needed maximum discretion. The rise of personal piety, ironically, provided the perfect cover for private acts that were anything but pious in the eyes of the church. A quirky or fringe tidbit that adds another layer to this picture is the existence of medieval folk beliefs and practices related to fertility, sexuality, and contraception, which sometimes existed alongside or even in defiance of official church teaching. While the church condemned most forms of contraception and non-procreative sex, evidence from medical texts, folklore, and even court records hints at a range of traditional methods and beliefs circulating among the populace. This suggests a broader landscape of medieval sexuality that wasn't solely defined by canon law, and that women in particular may have had access to informal knowledge networks regarding their bodies and desires, even if such knowledge was clandestine. This creates a context where seeking private sexual fulfillment, while risky, wasn't entirely outside the realm of possibility for a medieval woman. Historians still argue whether the relative scarcity of such finds means they were exceptionally rare, perhaps used only by women in very specific circumstances, like long-term separation from a husband, or in certain social circles, or if they were simply difficult to preserve and thus most have been lost to time. Wood decays and objects not explicitly deemed valuable or sacred are less likely to be carefully stored and more likely to be discarded or lost. So are these just a few surviving examples of a more widespread practice, or are they truly anomalies? Without more archaeological evidence, it remains an open scholarly debate, leaving plenty of room for speculation and further research. It's the archaeological equivalent of finding one single, slightly weird sock and wondering if it belonged to a whole set of weird socks, or if it was just one weird sock. Synthesizing everything we've explored, the rigid social structures, the emphasis on chastity and procreation, the lack of female autonomy, the necessity of discretion, the unexpected hiding places, the glimpses into private lives. We build a richer, more nuanced picture of the past. These objects, seemingly so small and insignificant, become keys to understanding a world that is both vastly different from our own and surprisingly familiar in its fundamental human drives. They remind us that resilience, ingenuity, and the pursuit of personal comfort are timeless aspects of the human experience, transcending the centuries and the confines of societal norms. This journey through the dusty corners of history, contemplating the secrets hidden within sacred texts, allows us to connect with the past on a deeply personal level. It's not about judging these medieval women, it's about recognizing their existence, understanding the pressures they faced, and perhaps feeling a quiet sense of solidarity with their struggle for agency and selfhood in a world that gave them so little control. It reminds us that even in times of great constraint, individuals find ways to live, to desire, and to keep secrets. As we wrap up this exploration, the image of the prayer book and its hidden contents remains potent. It's a symbol of layers, the layer of public piety overlaying the layer of private desire, the sacred containing the profane, the expected concealing the unexpected. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of history, to question the dominant narratives, and to search for the quiet, often hidden stories of individual lives that make the past truly come alive. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see a seemingly mundane historical object, you'll wonder what secrets it might hold, waiting to be uncovered. Now, as the dust settles on our historical journey, feel the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. The images of ancient script and hidden objects are fading, softening at the edges. The questions about medieval lives and desires are becoming distant whispers, dissolving into the quiet hum of the night. Let your mind drift away from the complexities of the past, from the pressures and the secrets. Allow the stillness to settle around you, gentle and comforting. The world of kings and commoners, of prayer books and hidden desires, is receding, leaving you here, safe and warm. There's nothing left to figure out, nothing left to search for. Just breathe softly. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest. The quiet is embracing you, pulling you down into a space of calm and rest. The stories are told, the mysteries have revealed their truths, or at least some possibilities. Let your muscles relax one by one. The prayer book is closed, the secret is safe. All that tension you might be holding on to, just release it, like letting go of a heavy weight you didn't even realize you were carrying. Sink deeper now, into the comfort of your bed, into the stillness of the night. Allow sleep to wash over you like a gentle wave, erasing the edges of conscious thought, carrying you toward dreams. The past is past, but its whispers have shown us something beautiful about human resilience. Rest now, sleep soundly,